My name is Nia, 32 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful mergers and acquisitions specialist, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact only when absolutely necessary to protect the few people I actually cared about. At the reading of my grandfather's will, my brother threw a document across the table and declared I was getting nothing for cutting them off. "All the properties are mine," he said while my parents smirked. I said nothing. Then the trust attorney opened a folder and spoke up, and my brother started screaming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia meant projecting a flawless image of Black excellence to the outside world. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house, with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Beatrice's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's and joined honor societies, yet I was always the invisible daughter. The air inside Attorney Sterling's office in Midtown Atlanta was thick with a heavy, suffocating hostility that I had known my entire life. The room was intimidating, lined with dark mahogany bookshelves and featuring a massive floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the bustling city below. I sat perfectly straight in my chair, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that commanded respect in the corporate boardrooms I navigated daily. Across the wide oak table sat my family, arranged like a firing squad, ready to execute their final judgment. My brother Jamal, at 35 years old, slouched in his leather chair with the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a single consequence in his life. Beside him sat his wife Tasha, a 33-year-old woman who wore her insecurities disguised as luxury labels. Today, she was draped in ostentatious designer brands, a bright orange designer bag placed deliberately on the table as a monument to her perceived status. My parents, Beatrice and Desmond, sat shoulder to shoulder, presenting the unified, flawless front they had spent decades perfecting for our church congregation and their elite social circles. They sat with their arms crossed, looking at me with a mixture of utter disdain and triumphant anticipation. The silence in the room was sharp enough to draw blood. Attorney Sterling, a distinguished older man with a calm demeanor, sat at the head of the table, arranging a stack of legal documents. He cleared his throat to begin the proceedings, but before he could even read the first line of my grandfather Ezekiel's will, Jamal lunged forward. With a dramatic, aggressive sweep of his arm, Jamal threw a thick, stapled copy of the will across the polished oak table. The heavy document slid across the wood and hit my coffee mug, splashing a few dark drops onto the legal pad in front of me. "You get nothing for cutting us off," Jamal declared, his voice booming and echoing off the mahogany walls. He pointed a finger directly at my face, a vein popping in his neck as he leaned across the table. "All the properties are mine. The entire commercial real estate empire Grandpa built belongs to me now. This is what you deserve for turning your back on your own blood." I did not flinch. I did not wipe the spilled coffee. I simply looked at the document resting near my hands, and then shifted my gaze to my brother's flushed face. His chest heaved with the exertion of his outburst. He had waited 2 years for this moment, 2 years of building up this fantasy, where he finally got to crush me legally and financially. He expected tears. He expected me to beg. He expected a dramatic breakdown that would validate every terrible thing they had ever said about me. Instead, I gave him absolute silence. My lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Tasha, who let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You really thought you were going to walk in here and get a piece of the pie? Did not you?" Tasha sneered, leaning closer to Jamal to present a united front. "You should have dressed a little better for the day you lost everything, Nia. Look at you in that boring gray suit. You look like a miserable cubicle worker. You really thought all those years of acting like you were better than us were going to pay off. Well, look who is holding the keys to the kingdom now." My parents did not reprimand Tasha for her disrespect. They never did. Instead, my mother Beatrice adjusted her posture and looked down her nose at me. Her expression was a masterclass in weaponized pity. "Tasha is right, Nia," my mother said, using that soft, patronizing church lady voice she reserved for moments of maximum cruelty. "This is God's way of humbling you. You have spent your entire life being so cold, so distant, so obsessed with your little corporate career. You refuse to serve this family. You refuse to submit to the values we tried to teach you. You thought your degrees made you smarter than the people who raised you. Well, a woman who abandons her family for a paycheck ends up exactly where you are right now, completely empty-handed." My father, Desmond, nodded slowly, his eyes locked onto mine with cold judgment. "Jamal is a man." My father added, his voice heavy with patriarchal authority. "He has a wife. He is building a legacy. The commercial real estate portfolio your grandfather built requires a strong male leader to take it to the next level. It requires someone who understands the community, someone who commands respect. You have always been too rigid, Nia, too focused on spreadsheets and boardrooms to understand how the real world works. You waste your life negotiating for strangers while your brother is ready to carry the Washington family name into the next generation." As they took turns delivering their rehearsed insults, my mind began to race, weaving their present cruelty into the tapestry of our past. I looked at Jamal, the undisputed golden child of the Washington family, and felt a profound sense of disgust. My parents had paraded Jamal around every alumni event and every Sunday service as the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence. They boasted about his entrepreneurial spirit and his grand visions for the future. The reality, however, was a rotting facade. Jamal was a chronic failure who had never successfully launched a single business. He had flunked out of college twice. He had started a luxury car detailing service that went bankrupt within 6 months, leaving a trail of unpaid suppliers. He had tried to launch an event promotion company that resulted in massive debts. And every single time he failed, my parents quietly drained their own accounts to bail him out, desperate to protect his reputation and their social standing in elite circles. Meanwhile, I was the invisible daughter. I graduated at the top of my class. I secured a full ride to a prestigious business school. I fought my way into the brutal male-dominated world of corporate acquisitions, breaking glass ceilings and negotiating deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I bought my own luxury penthouse. I paid off my own student loans. I built an ironclad financial fortress for myself. Yet in my family's eyes, I was a failure because I did not fit the mold of the endlessly sacrificing woman who sets herself on fire to keep her family warm. I refused to hand over my paychecks to fund Jamal's bad ideas. I refused to let my mother dictate my relationships. And for that crime of setting boundaries, I was labeled cold, selfish, and socially unfit. They expected me to be the workhorse who silently funded the family while Jamal took all the glory. When I finally cut them off 2 years ago, it was the ultimate act of rebellion. Now, sitting in this law office, they truly believed they had engineered my ultimate downfall. Jamal crossed his arms, a victorious smirk plastered across his face. "You see, Nia," Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You might be a big shot down at your little firm, but in the real world, loyalty is what pays." Grandpa Ezekiel knew who truly loved this family. He knew I was the only one capable of managing the empire. "So you can take your little briefcase and go back to your cubicle. You are done here." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. The air was so thick with their hostility and triumph that it was almost hard to breathe. They waited for my response, their eyes hungry for my devastation. I looked at the forged will resting on the table. I looked at Tasha's smug smile. I looked at my parents' self-righteous glares. And then, with deliberate slowness, I raised my left arm and checked my watch. The metallic click of my watch band seemed to echo in the silent room. I sighed softly, tracing the edge of my coffee mug with one manicured finger. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the silence stretch out, forcing them to sit in the uncomfortable void of my indifference. My complete lack of emotional reaction began to unravel them immediately. Jamal's smirk faltered. My mother's eyes narrowed in frustration. They had fired their best shots, and I was completely unbothered. I looked past my seething brother and made direct eye contact with Attorney Sterling, who had been watching the entire exchange with quiet, calculated observation. We had a lot of work to do, and I was tired of listening to children play pretend. Attorney Sterling, I said, my voice smooth, commanding, and absolutely devoid of fear. I believe we have wasted enough time on my brother's delusions. There are far more pressing matters at hand that require our immediate attention today. Please let us proceed to the actual estate. Beatrice scoffed, her posture rigid as she smoothed the invisible wrinkles from her tailored designer knit suit. She leaned forward, adopting that sickly sweet, heavily modulated tone she reserved for Sunday school meetings and passive-aggressive reprimands. Delusions, Beatrice repeated, shaking her head in mock sorrow. Oh, Nia. You are so lost in your own pride you cannot even see the writing on the wall. This is not a delusion, sweetheart. This is divine correction. She placed a manicured hand over her heart, playing the role of the deeply wounded but righteous matriarch. I prayed for you, Nia. I truly did. I asked the Lord to soften your heart, to teach you the value of submission and family loyalty. But you chose to walk a path of rebellion. You chose to abandon your own flesh and blood because you thought your corporate titles made you invincible. You refused to honor your father and mother. You refused to support your brother. And now you are witnessing the consequences of a hardened heart. God does not reward the arrogant, Naya. He strips them of their idols. This disinheritance is exactly what you need to finally understand your place. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow. Just a clinical, detached observation of a master manipulator at work. Beatrice Washington did not care about God's will. She cared about optics. She cared about control. And right now, she was trying to gaslight me into believing that my financial independence was a spiritual failing. My parents had spent their entire lives worshiping at the altar of an illusion. To the outside world, specifically, the black elite of Atlanta, the Washingtons were the epitome of black excellence. They hosted charity galas, dominated alumni events for their respective historically black colleges, and sat on the boards of local philanthropic organizations. But maintaining that flawless veneer required a staggering amount of capital, both financial and emotional. Jamal was the centerpiece of their grand illusion. He possessed the right look, the right fraternity affiliations, and the right rehearsed charm to play the part of the successful heir apparent. Behind closed doors, however, Jamal was a financial sinkhole. I had spent years watching my parents quietly siphon their own wealth to cover his tracks. When his luxury car detailing business collapsed under the weight of unpaid vendor invoices, my parents drained a portion of their retirement savings to settle the lawsuits before they went public. When his upscale event promotion company tanked, they took out a second mortgage on their home. They justified every bailout as an investment in his potential. Yet when I secured a vice president position at a top-tier firm executing nine-figure corporate mergers, they dismissed my success entirely. To them, my career was an inconvenience because I refused to use my hard-earned capital to fund their golden child's mistakes. They viewed my boundaries as an act of treason. I was the ungrateful daughter who had broken rank, exposing the fragile reality that their perfect son was a fraud. Jamal scoffed, running a hand over his perfectly faded haircut. He leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head, thoroughly enjoying what he perceived as my desperate denial. Let her cope. Ma Jamal chuckled, his voice thick with unearned arrogance. She is in shock. It is hard for her to accept that all those late nights in the office do not mean a thing when you do not have the family legacy backing you up. But it is done, Nia. The ink is dry. In fact, the wheels are already in motion. Attorney Sterling remained motionless at the head of the table, his hands resting flat against his leather portfolio. He did not interrupt. He simply watched the train wreck unfold with the professional detachment of a man who knew exactly how this meeting was going to end. What wheels, Jamal? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. I needed him to say it. I needed him to put every single one of his catastrophic decisions on the record. I am not just sitting on Grandpa's properties like some stagnant landlord, Jamal bragged, leaning forward to plant his elbows on the table. I am expanding the empire, Real estate is about leverage, Nia. You should know that being the big corporate genius you claim to be. I took Grandpa's three biggest commercial properties downtown, the ones on Peachtree, the Auburn Avenue high-rise, and the logistics center. He paused, waiting for me to react. When I simply maintained my cold stare, he smirked wider, ready to deliver his finishing blow. I leveraged them, Jamal announced proudly. I took that. Will you are looking at, walked right into the executive branch of First Atlanta Bank and secured a $5 million commercial mortgage against those buildings. $5 million in liquid capital, Nia. All approved and finalized yesterday afternoon. I am putting this family on the map in a way Grandpa Ezekiel never had the vision to do. A profound, chilling silence settled over my side of the table. I did not blink. $5 million. He had actually done it. He had leveraged properties using a document he barely understood to secure a massive commercial loan. The sheer magnitude of his stupidity was breathtaking. He had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy him completely. As a mergers and acquisitions specialist, my entire career was built on identifying liabilities. I spent my days conducting grueling due diligence on corporate entities, tearing apart financial statements, and exposing hidden risks that could tank a massive deal. I knew the anatomy of financial fraud intimately. I knew exactly how banks operated, how underwriters scrutinized commercial loans, and how the federal government prosecuted individuals who submitted fraudulent claims to federally insured financial institutions. Listening to Jamal brag about his $5 million mortgage was like watching a toddler play with a loaded firearm. He did not understand the difference between holding a piece of paper and holding legal title. He did not understand the grueling legal mechanics of the probate process, assuming that a mere unverified will automatically granted him immediate, uncontested ownership of commercial real estate. He had walked into a bank, presented a document that had not even been submitted to a probate court, and somehow, through a combination of fast-talking, fabricated financial histories and likely some highly questionable connections within the bank's loan department, he had managed to secure a massive payout. It was a catastrophic error, a fatal, irreversible mistake, and my parents were sitting right there applauding him for it. Before I could even process the legal ramifications of his confession, Tasha eagerly jumped into the conversation. She leaned across the table, her heavy gold bracelets clanking loudly against the wood, her eyes wide with manic excitement. "And that $5 million is funding my new flagship restaurant in Buckhead?" Tasha boasted, flipping her long, expensive extensions over her shoulder. "We are calling it Aura by Tasha. It is going to be the most exclusive high-end dining experience Atlanta has ever seen. We already secured the lease, paid the contractors, and hired a Michelin star chef." She looked at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered malice. She wanted to twist the knife, eager to show off the spoils of a war she thought she had already won. "You see, Nia, while you were busy cutting us off and acting like you were too good for this family, Jamal and I were out here securing the bag," Tasha said, her voice rising in pitch. "We have a production crew from a major network following us right now. They are outside in the lobby waiting for us to finish this little meeting. I am going to be the breakout star of a brand new reality series focusing on Atlanta's elite power couples. The network loves the storyline. A young, powerful black couple taking over a historic real estate empire and launching a luxury lifestyle brand. It is television gold." Tasha leaned back, crossing her arms, a look of supreme satisfaction resting on her carefully contoured face. "We are hosting the grand opening launch party in 2 weeks." Tasha continued, her voice dripping with venom. "The guest list is strictly exclusive. Politicians, athletes, the biggest names in the city. I would invite you, Naya, but frankly you do not fit the aesthetic of our brand anymore. We need people who represent success, not bitter single women who just lost their inheritance." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer scale of the disaster they had engineered for themselves. Tasha had cameras following her. She had signed a network television contract based on fraudulent wealth. Jamal had committed to massive contractor payouts, restaurant leases, and television deals, using bank funds he had no legal right to secure. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff, entirely blind to the drop below. $5 million, I repeated softly, letting the number hang in the air. You took out a $5 million commercial loan against the Peachtree, Auburn Avenue, and Logistics Center properties. That is right, Jamal said, puffing out his chest. Signed, sealed, and delivered. The funds cleared escrow yesterday. We are untouchable now. You are looking at the new king of the Washington Empire. My parents beamed at him. Desmond clapped Jamal on the shoulder, his face glowing with a toxic pride. That is my son, Desmond declared. Taking bold risks, building wealth, doing what needs to be done for the family. Beatrice nodded in agreement, giving me a final dismissive glance. Learn from your brother, Nia. This is what true success looks like. This is what God blesses. I looked at the four of them, a unified front of arrogance, greed, and breathtaking ignorance. They had built a towering castle of cards, and they were practically begging me to light the match. I turned my attention back to Attorney Sterling, who was watching me with a look of profound professional respect. He knew exactly what Jamal had done. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Tasha was still glaring at me, waiting for me to break down. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to flip the table. She wanted an emotional reaction to justify her own cruelty. But I was not going to give her that satisfaction. I was going to let them continue to dig their own graves. The suffocating silence stretched on, heavy and absolute. I did not blink, and I did not look away from my family. My complete refusal to engage with their gloating created a sudden uncomfortable vacuum in the room. Jamal shifted in his leather chair, the triumphant smirk on his face faltering just a fraction as my silence refused to validate his performance. Tasha busied herself by violently adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet, avoiding my gaze. They had fired their heaviest artillery, expecting to watch my world crumble into dust, but I was sitting before them like a stone monument. Sensing the loss of momentum, my father decided it was his turn to reclaim the floor. Desmond Washington was a man who required total submission from the women in his life, and my stoic demeanor was an affront to his patriarchal authority. He cleared his throat loudly, a harsh grating sound that echoed off the mahogany bookshelves, and leaned his heavy frame across the polished oak table. Now that we have established the legal reality of your situation, Nia, we need to discuss your moral obligations. My father began, his voice dropping into a low, commanding baritone. You may have been entirely cut out of this estate, and rightfully so, but you still carry the Washington name. And right now, that name is the only thing keeping you from being completely exiled from our community. We are willing to offer you a chance at redemption. I raised a single eyebrow, inviting him to continue. The audacity of this man was truly something to behold. He was sitting in a lawyer's office, having just gleefully informed me that I was disinherited, and in the very next breath he was offering me a pathway to redemption. Your grandfather was a titan in Atlanta, my father proclaimed, placing his large hands flat on the table. A man of his stature required a homegoing celebration that reflected his legacy. We gave him a funeral fit for a king. We spared absolutely no expense because that is what Black excellence demands. We commanded the respect of the entire city. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He tossed it onto the table right next to the forged will Jamal had thrown at me moments earlier. Inside that envelope is the consolidated invoice for Ezekiel's funeral services. My father stated, his eyes locking onto mine with cold, unyielding authority. The total comes to exactly $45,000. We arranged for a custom-imported bronze casket. We had thousands of white orchids flown in from Holland to drape the sanctuary. We hired a horse-drawn carriage to carry him through downtown Atlanta, and we hosted a catered reception for 500 of the city's most elite residents at the Buckhead Country Club. It was a flawless event. I stared at the cream-colored envelope, my mind instantly dissecting the absolute absurdity of their financial recklessness. $45,000 for a funeral. They had spent the equivalent of a luxury car or a down payment on a house just to throw a party for a corpse, all to show off for people they actively despised. Ezekiel had been a simple, hard-working man who preferred sitting on his back porch with a glass of sweet tea over mingling at country clubs. He would have been violently ill knowing they spent $45,000 on a horse-drawn carriage and imported orchids. It was a grotesque display of vanity funded entirely by their obsession with maintaining an illusion of wealth. And since you are walking away from this table with nothing, my father continued delivering what he clearly believed was a crushing blow. The absolute least you can do to prove you still have a shred of respect for this family is to cover that invoice. You will pay the $45,000 out of your own pocket, Nia. Today. Consider it your final debt to the man you abandoned. You pay this bill, and we will graciously allow you to continue associating with the family name. You walk away, and you are dead to us entirely. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the extortion attempt hung in the air. They had just told me I was disinherited, that Jamal was taking the entire commercial real estate empire, and their immediate follow-up was to demand I write them a check for $45,000. It was a predatory shakedown executed with the self-righteous entitlement only toxic family members can muster. When I did not immediately reach for my checkbook, my mother decided to escalate the pressure. Beatrice Washington dropped the sweet, condescending church lady act completely. The mask slipped, revealing the vicious, calculating social climber underneath. She leaned forward, her perfectly styled hair framing a face twisted with pure venom. "Do not look at us like we are asking for a favor, Nia," my mother hissed, her voice sharp and cutting. "We are giving you a lifeline. You think you are so secure in your little corporate bubble. You think your six-figure salary makes you untouchable. But you work in mergers and acquisitions, do you not? Your entire career is built on relationships, reputation, and trust. What do you think is going to happen to that precious reputation when the elite circles of Atlanta find out exactly what kind of woman you are?" She paused, letting the threat marinate, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "If you do not open your designer bag and write a check for $45,000 right now, I will make a few phone calls before I even reach the parking garage." Beatrice threatened, her eyes flashing with malice. "I will call Pastor Higgins and the entire board of elders at the church. I will call the president of the local Delta alumni chapter. I will call every single one of your former sorority sisters, your mentors, and the corporate partners we mingle with at the country club." She tapped her manicured fingernail against the table with each escalating threat. "I will tell them that you are broke," my mother declared smoothly. "I will tell them that you are destitute, that your corporate career is a sham, and that you begged us for money today. I will tell them that you were cut out of your grandfather's will because you lost your mind and abandoned your family in our greatest time of need. I will say you are a heartless, bitter woman who refused to contribute a single dime to bury the grandfather who loved you. I will ruin your name in black corporate Atlanta. You will be a social pariah, Nia. No one will do business with a woman who abandons her own blood." The room grew heavy with the weight of her blackmail. Beatrice was entirely serious. She possessed the social capital and the sheer ruthlessness to execute a smear campaign that could in theory cause significant friction in my professional life. She knew how to weaponize gossip, how to twist a narrative until she was the bleeding victim and I was the cold-blooded villain. She believed she had me backed into an inescapable corner. Pay the extortion fee or face total social and professional annihilation. Tasha, emboldened by my mother's vicious attack, decided to add her own petty insults to the mix. She crossed her legs, swinging a stiletto heel aggressively as she looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "You heard your mother," Nia, Tasha sneered, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Stop acting like you are above us and pay what you owe. I know you do not have Jamal's kind of money, and you certainly do not have my reality television budget, but that little corporate desk job of yours should be good for at least paying the catering bill. Just write the check and go back to your lonely apartment. You are embarrassing yourself by sitting here pretending you have any power in this room." Jamal laughed, a loud, booming sound that filled the office. He reached over and high-fived his wife, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my targeted humiliation. "Yeah, Nia," Jamal added, pointing at the cream-colored envelope. "Pay the toll. It is the cost of doing business with the Washington Empire. Maybe if you write the check fast enough, Tasha and I will let you sweep the floors at our new restaurant before the cameras start rolling." They were all staring at me now. Jamal, Tasha, Beatrice, and Desmond. 4 vultures circling what they believed was a carcass. They expected me to break. They expected me to panic at the threat to my career, to pull out my checkbook with shaking hands, and to buy their silence for $45,000. They thought my silence was the paralysis of a defeated woman realizing she had lost everything. They were spectacularly wrong. My silence was not paralysis. It was calculation. Sitting in that chair absorbing their blows, my corporate instincts had taken complete control. I was no longer the scapegoated daughter or the bullied sister. I was a mergers and acquisitions specialist executing a hostile takeover, and the people across the table were a poorly managed, debt-riddled asset that was about to be liquidated. I looked at my father, who was demanding money for a gaudy funeral he used to boost his own ego. I looked at my mother, who was threatening to destroy my career with church gossip. I looked at Tasha and Jamal bragging about leveraging a forged will to fund a reality television fantasy. Every word they had spoken over the last 20 minutes was a confession. Every threat they made was a vulnerability I was about to exploit. They had mistaken my professional composure for weakness. Instead of crying, instead of begging, and instead of reaching for a checkbook to pay their extortion fee, I slowly leaned down. I placed my hands on the smooth, cold leather of my designer briefcase resting on the floor beside my chair. The narrative in the room shifted instantly as they watched me move. Their smug smiles faltered, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. I lifted the heavy leather briefcase and placed it squarely on the center of the polished oak table. The solid thud of the bag hitting the wood echoed like a gavel strike. I kept my eyes locked on my mother as I rested my thumbs on the twin brass latches. With two sharp, synchronized clicks, the locks snapped open. The sound was deafening in the suddenly quiet room. I was done absorbing their blows. The time for sitting silently and letting them dig their own graves was over. They had demanded a reckoning, and I was absolutely thrilled to provide one. I opened the briefcase, ready to deliver my first counteroffensive. I reached into the plush, silk-lined interior of my designer briefcase. I bypassed the standard legal pads and my tablet, pulling out a thick, heavy stack of financial records. The papers were bound tightly by heavy black binder clips, the edges of the pages bleeding with bright yellow, pink, and green highlighter marks. I held the stack for a fraction of a second, letting the anticipation build in the quiet room before letting it drop flat onto the center of the oak table. The heavy, solid thwack of the paper hitting the wood made my mother jump in her seat. "You want $45,000 for a funeral?" I said, my voice dangerously calm, completely devoid of the panic they so desperately craved. "You threatened to call my sorority sisters, my corporate mentors, and my church elders to tell them I am broke. You want to weave a desperate, vicious narrative of my financial ruin to cover up your own." I slid the top folder across the table. It glided over the polished wood and stopped perfectly in front of my father's clenched fists. "Let us talk about financial ruin, Desmond," I said, dropping the title of Dad entirely. "Let us talk about where the great Washington family wealth actually went." My father looked down at the folder. I watched his eyes widen as he recognized the logo of his wealth management firm printed on the letterhead. He did not touch it. His hands remained frozen on the table, his knuckles turning white. "Open to page 3, I instructed coldly. "Or I can just recite it from memory, since I have spent the last 14 months analyzing these exact statements. 3 years ago, your 401k held a very respectable balance of $850,000. It was a comfortable nest egg for a man planning to retire. Today, as of last Tuesday's closing bell, that account contains exactly $4,212. My mother let out a sharp, genuine gasp, her hand flying to her throat as if she were choking. She darted a panicked, wide-eyed look at Attorney Sterling, who remained perfectly impassive, his eyes fixed steadily on me. "And Beatrice," I continued, turning my gaze to my mother, completely ignoring her shock. "Your pristine portfolio of municipal bonds and high-yield mutual funds, the ones you loved to brag about at the country club, luncheons, the ones you claimed were building generational wealth, completely liquidated. Every single asset was sold off over an 18-month period, incurring massive early withdrawal penalties and a brutal capital gains tax hit that you still have not paid the IRS for." Jamal's smug, victorious posture evaporated instantly. He sat up completely straight, the color rapidly draining from his face, until he looked sickly and pale. He looked from me to the folders, and back again, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The arrogant king of the real estate empire was suddenly terrified. "Shut up!" Nia Jamal ordered, his voice completely lacking its previous booming authority. It was a panicked, reedy sound, desperate and thin. "This is private family business. You have no right to bring these documents in here." "This is an estate reading, Jamal." I fired back, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "Financial disclosures are entirely relevant, especially when our parents are attempting to extort me to cover a lavish funeral they cannot afford because they gave every last dime of their retirement to you." Tasha turned sharply toward her husband, her heavy lashes blinking rapidly in sheer confusion. "Jamal, what is she talking about?" Tasha asked, her voice shrill. "What retirement money? You told me your parents were investing in your new logistics firm." "Do not listen to her, Tasha. She is lying," Jamal stammered, reaching a desperate hand out to grab the folder from in front of my father. I slammed my hand down on the documents, pinning them to the table before his fingers could graze the paper. "I am not lying, Tasha," I said, looking directly at my sister-in-law. For the first time today, I felt a microscopic sliver of pity for her. She was a pawn in their grand illusion, completely unaware of the rotting house of cards she had married into. "Your husband is not a misunderstood entrepreneur. He is not a real estate mogul building an empire. Jamal is a degenerate gambling addict." The word hung in the air, toxic and undeniable. The perfect black excellence facade shattered into a million jagged pieces right there on the mahogany table. Offshore sports betting platforms, high-stakes poker tables in underground Atlanta circuits, unregulated crypto casinos. I listed them off with clinical precision, tapping the highlighted lines on the bank statements with my index finger. I tracked the wire transfers. I tracked the massive cash withdrawals disguised as consulting fees for his fake shell companies. Jamal was losing sometimes $20,000 a week. And when the bookie started calling, when the loan sharks threatened to break his legs and shatter this family's precious, flawless image, Beatrice and Desmond stepped in to save the day. I looked at my parents. Their faces were masks of pure, unadulterated horror. Their ultimate secret, the shameful truth they had sacrificed their entire future to protect, was laid bare in front of the trust attorney, their daughter-in-law, and the daughter they had just tried to destroy. They were paralyzed by the exposure. "You bled them dry, Jamal," I said, my voice laced with absolute chilling disgust. "You took the money they worked 40 years to save, and you threw it away on bad parlays and rigged tables. You let them mortgage their home to the absolute limit. You let them empty their retirement accounts and pay the penalty fees. You let them ruin their golden years just so you could keep driving a leased Mercedes and playing pretend for your fraternity brothers. You are not a businessman. You are a parasite. That is enough." My father croaked, his voice barely a whisper. The commanding, booming patriarch from 5 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a broken, humiliated old man who could not even look his own attorney in the eye. "Nia, please, stop." "No, it is not enough," I snapped, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. I was bringing the entire structure down. "You sat there and called me a failure. You let my mother threaten my career and my reputation. You demanded I pay $45,000 for a horse-drawn carriage to bury a man who preferred a quiet life, all because you are too broke to afford the caterer. You thought you could bully me into funding your vanity project because you have absolutely nothing left in the bank." Tasha was breathing heavily now, her chest heaving as her eyes darted frantically between Jamal and my parents. The terrifying reality of her situation was crashing down on her in real time. The $5 million commercial loan the reality television show contracts the luxury restaurant in Buckhead with the Michelin star chef. It was all built on the shoulders of a man who had secretly bankrupted his own parents to feed a crippling addiction. She was not starring in a show about a power couple. She was married to a fraud facing financial ruin. "Jamal, tell me she is lying," Tasha demanded, her voice trembling with rising panic. She grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging deep into the fabric of his suit jacket. "Tell me you did not take their retirement money. Tell me you did not gamble it away. Tell me we are not broke." Jamal could not even look at her. He stared at the polished oak table, a fine sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. His silence was the loudest, most damning confession in the room. Tasha let go of his arm as if his skin were suddenly radioactive, sliding her heavy leather chair several inches away from him. The perfect, unstoppable power couple was disintegrating before my eyes. My mother began to weep, her shoulders shaking violently as she buried her face in her hands. There was no church lady dignity left in her posture. It was the ugly, desperate crying of a woman who realized her entire life's work of social climbing, curating, and pretending had amounted to absolute, undeniable ruin. I watched them fall apart with the detached calculation of an M&A specialist watching a rival corporation declare bankruptcy after a hostile takeover. They had begged for this war. They had brought me to this office to humiliate me, and I was giving them exactly what they asked for. "I have known about your total financial collapse for over a year," I told them coldly, gathering the folders and tapping them neatly against the table to align the edges. "I saw the signs when you started asking for strange short-term loans. I pulled the public records. I hired forensic accountants to trace the shell companies Jamal set up. I watched you enable his sickness to protect your precious reputation in this city, and I watched you try to drag me down into the mud with you." I slipped the heavy documents back into my designer briefcase and snapped the brass latches closed. The sharp clicks echoed in the silent, tense room, sounding like a vault locking shut. "So, no, Desmond," I said, looking my father dead in the eye as he stared blankly at his hands. "I will not be writing you a check for $45,000 today. I will not pay for those ridiculous imported white orchids. I will not pay for the custom bronze casket or the horse-drawn carriage. And I certainly will not pay to redeem my name in a social circle of hypocrites and gossips that I care absolutely nothing about." I leaned back in my chair, smoothing the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit. The balance of power in the room had shifted completely and permanently. I was no longer the defendant on trial waiting to be sentenced by a family that despised me. I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and I held all the cards. "I will not pay your exorbitant funeral bill," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute chilling finality because I already spent my money on something much more important. Something that none of you in your endless, sickening pursuit of vanity and greed ever bothered to care about when it actually mattered. The silence that followed my declaration was different from the stunned quiet of the financial reveal. This was a heavy, suffocating confusion. My mother's tear-streaked face snapped up, her eyes narrowing as her calculating mind tried to decipher my meaning. Desmond shifted his considerable bulk in his chair, leaning away from the evidence of his ruin as if the physical distance could protect him from the truth. "What are you talking about?" Jamal demanded, his voice defensive but lacking its previous venom. "You did not spend a dime on this family. You walked out on us 2 years ago. You blocked our numbers, ignored the holidays, and turned your back on the Washington name. You abandoned us." I stared at my brother, feeling a cold, crystalline focus settle over me. "I did not abandon you, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "I rescued grandfather Ezekiel from you." The mention of Ezekiel's name sent a visible shockwave through the room. Tasha looked between Jamal and my parents, clearly missing the context of a family secret she had not been privy to. Attorney Sterling simply folded his hands on his desk, his face a mask of professional neutrality, though his eyes betrayed a deep understanding of the ugly history we were about to unearth. "Let us talk about why I cut contact 2 years ago." I continued, refusing to break eye contact with my father. "Let us talk about the elephant in the room. 2 years ago, when Grandpa Ezekiel first fell ill, when his heart started failing, and the doctors transferred him to Emory University Hospital, this entire family gathered in his private suite. You all stood around his bed, wiping away fake tears and performing for the nurses." Desmond's face darkened, his jaw clenching. He was an old man, Nia. His heart was failing. The doctors said his chances were slim. "The doctors said his chances with standard care were slim," I corrected sharply, slicing through his lie. "But they also offered an alternative. An expensive, life-saving experimental treatment. A specialized cardiac protocol that had an 80% success rate for his specific condition." I remember the exact moment the chief cardiologist handed you that pamphlet, Desmond. I remember watching you and Beatrice exchange a look. A very specific, calculating look. My mother stood up her chair, scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "Do not! You dare!" Beatrice shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. "Do not! You dare sit there and rewrite history. We were making the hardest decision a family has to make. We were trusting God's will. We were accepting that it was His time to go home to the Lord. You were accepting that His death would solve your financial ruin," I fired back, my voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "The treatment cost $300,000 out of pocket. It was not covered by his primary insurance. And you, all three of you, conspired to deny him that care. You sat in that hospital corridor, whispering like cowards, deciding that spending $300,000 to save his life would cut into the inheritance you so desperately needed. Jamal owed the bookies. You and Dad had drained your 401k. You needed the Washington real estate empire to become liquid, and you needed it fast." Tasha gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared at Jamal in absolute horror. "You let him die," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You let your own grandfather die for money." "He did not die, Tasha," I said, my gaze shifting to my sister-in-law, commanding her attention. "Because I did not let them kill him." I turned back to my parents, my disgust radiating through every syllable. "You told the doctors to initiate palliative care. You authorized them to make him comfortable and let him pass away quickly so you could read the will and start cashing checks. You decided his life was worth less than your gambling debts and your country club dues. You literally placed a price tag on the man who built everything you have ever enjoyed." Beatrice was shaking, her face flushed a deep mottled red. "That is a lie. That is a wicked, demonic lie. It is the absolute sickening truth," I stated, my voice unwavering. "And you know it. Jamal knows it. Dad knows it. That is why I walked into that hospital room, fired the attending physician you manipulated, and invoked my emergency medical power of attorney. I let the memory of that day flood the room. I painted the picture with brutal clinical precision. I reminded them of how I had marched into the cardiac ward with a private medical transport team, how I had physically placed my body between Jamal and the hospital administrators when he tried to block the transfer. I paid the $300,000 out of my own pocket, I told them, my voice ringing with undeniable truth. I wired the funds directly to the specialized facility in Houston. I hired the private air ambulance. I secured the top-tier surgical team. While you three were practically picking out the flowers for his funeral and calculating your payouts, I was liquidating my stock options to keep his heart beating. Jamal slammed his fist against the table, a desperate, frantic attempt to regain control of the narrative. "You kidnapped him!" Jamal roared, his voice cracking with panic. "He was sick and confused, and you stole him away in the middle of the night. You took him out of state where we could not reach him. You isolated an elderly man." "Kidnapped him?" I repeated, a bitter, humorless smile touching the corners of my mouth. "I moved him to a private world-class rehabilitation center where he received round-the-clock care, physical therapy, and the exact cardiac protocol you refused to pay for. I funded his survival. I gave him 2 more years of life. 2 years of sunrises, 2 years of lucid conversations, 2 years of peace away from the toxic, blood-sucking parasites who were waiting for him to flatline." Beatrice was pacing now, her hands clutching her designer handbag as if it were a life preserver. "You took my father away from me," she wailed, her voice echoing with manufactured grief. "You stole him, and then you locked us out. You would not tell us where he was. You would not let us speak to him. Because he asked me not to, I delivered the final crushing blow. He woke up in that Houston facility, Beatrice. He recovered, and when his mind cleared, he asked me exactly what had happened in Atlanta. I did not have to lie. I showed him the medical charts. I showed him the palliative care orders you and Desmond signed. He realized his own daughter and his precious golden grandson were content to let him suffocate in a hospital bed to expedite their payday. The stress of your betrayal nearly gave him a second heart attack. He explicitly instructed the facility security to bar you from the premises. He chose to cut you off. The room descended into a chaotic, heavy silence, broken only by Tasha's rapid, panicked breathing. My parents looked physically diminished, as if the sheer weight of their exposed sins was pressing them into the floorboards. But Beatrice Washington was a woman who would rather die than accept accountability. She stopped pacing, her eyes flashing with a cornered, desperate malice. "So, you play the hero?" Beatrice spat, her voice venomous. "You swoop in with your corporate money, steal an old man, and expect a medal. You think no one knows what you really are. You think your reputation is so pristine. We told everyone the truth, Nia. We told the entire city what you did." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the oak table. "I know exactly what you told them, Beatrice." I watched her flinch. She had relied on the assumption that I was oblivious to her whisper campaigns. She had banked on my silence as proof of my guilt. "You went to the church elders," I said, ticking off her betrayals on my fingers. "You went to my former sorority sisters. You sat at the country club luncheons sipping mimosas, and you cried those big crocodile tears. You spread malicious, disgusting rumors throughout black corporate Atlanta. You told everyone I had suffered a mental breakdown. You claimed the stress of my job had driven me insane. You whispered that I had forcefully removed a dying man from his loving family out of pure, spiteful jealousy because I could not handle Jamal being the favorite." My father looked away, unable to meet my gaze. Jamal stared at his lap. They had all participated in the smear campaign. They had weaponized my absence, using my refusal to engage with their toxicity as proof of my supposed insanity. "You dragged my name through the mud." I continued, my voice cold and hard as steel. "You tried to destroy my professional credibility by labeling me unstable. You played the grieving, victimized family so perfectly. You accepted casseroles and prayers from the congregation while actively hoping your father would die out of state so you could inherit his buildings. You projected this flawless facade of black excellence while hiding a reality so horrific, so utterly depraved that it defies human comprehension." Tasha pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. She looked at Jamal with a mixture of revulsion and sheer terror. "You told me she was crazy," Tasha whispered, her voice shaking. "You told me she was a bitter spinster who hated us for being happy. You never told me you refused to pay for his medical care. You never told me he recovered." "Shut up," Tasha, Jamal hissed, his face twisted in panic. "She is spinning this. She is trying to confuse you. I am simply stating the facts." I said, my gaze sweeping over the four of them. "You wanted the funeral paid for. I am telling you why I will not give you a single dime. I paid $300,000 to save his life. I paid another $200,000 for his private care over the last 2 years. I gave him dignity, I gave him safety, and I gave him the truth. Your gaslighting does not work on me anymore. Your rumors do not touch me. You spent 2 years telling the world I lost my mind, all to cover up the fact that you are nothing but greedy, negligent monsters." Desmond finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw set in a hard, defiant line. He had been stripped of his dignity, exposed as a fraud and a failure, but his patriarchal pride refused to die quietly. "It does not matter," my father growled, his voice vibrating with a desperate, dark energy. He slammed his heavy hand onto the polished oak table, pointing a thick finger at the forged will Jamal had thrown earlier. "It does not matter what you spent, Nia. It does not matter what kind of hero you think you are. You can sit there and judge us all you want. You can act like your corporate money makes you a saint. But at the end of the day, you played a stupid game and you lost. You spent $500,000 keeping a dying man alive, and what did it get you? Nothing. Because while you were busy playing nursemaid in Texas, Jamal was securing the legacy." My brother's head snapped up. A glimmer of his previous arrogance returned, a desperate lifeline in the middle of his drowning reality. He grabbed the stapled document on the table and held it up like a shield. "Dad is right," Jamal sneered, though his hand trembled slightly. "Your little sob story means absolutely nothing in the eyes of the law. You think you outsmarted us. You think you are so brilliant. But I am the one holding the will. I am the sole heir. You wasted your money, Nia. You funded his little vacation, and I got the empire at the finish line." They were clinging to the forged document as if it were a holy relic. They had been utterly exposed as financial parasites and moral failures, yet they still believed their street-level manipulation had bested my corporate intellect. They still believed they had won. I looked at the document in Jamal's trembling hand. I looked at the desperate, greedy anticipation returning to my parents' faces. They were setting the trap, preparing to deliver their ultimate ultimatum, entirely unaware that the jaws were about to snap shut on their own necks. Jamal took a deep breath, inhaling the stale air of the office as if it were pure oxygen. The slight tremor in his fingers vanished completely. He slapped the stapled document onto the oak table, smoothing out the creases with the flat of his palm. He looked at me, and a slow, ugly grin spread across his face. He threw his head back and laughed. It was not a nervous chuckle, but a full, chest-deep roar of absolute unrestrained arrogance. "You really thought you had us," Jamal chuckled, wiping a fake tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. "You came in here with your highlighted bank statements and your dramatic little speeches thinking you were going to drop the microphone and walk out a winner. But you forgot one crucial detail, Nia. Your sob story means absolutely nothing in the eyes of the law." He pointed aggressively at the document, tapping the thick paper with enough force to echo through the quiet room. "This is what matters," Jamal declared, his voice dripping with condescension. "This piece of paper, ink and signatures, that is all the probate court cares about. They do not care who paid the medical bills. They do not care who held his hand in the hospital. They do not care about your moral superiority. They only care about who has the final legally binding directive, and that is me." I watched him, my expression completely blank, allowing him the space to hang himself with his own words. "You think you are so smart because you hid him in Texas?" Jamal sneered, leaning over the table, his face inches from the document. "But you underestimated me. You always do. You think because I do not wear a suit to a glass tower every day that I am stupid." I tracked him down, Nia. It took some doing, and it cost me a few favors with people who know how to find things. But I found your little secret facility in Houston. My mother smiled, a sickening display of maternal pride washing over her features. "Tell her how you did it," baby Beatrice encouraged, practically vibrating with renewed confidence. "Tell your sister how real business is handled in the real world." 6 months ago, Jamal began puffing his chest out proudly. "While you were busy flying to London for some corporate merger, leaving the old man alone in that sterile room, I took a little trip to the Lone Star State. I walked right through the front doors of that luxury rehabilitation center during visiting hours. I brought a friend with me, a notary public, someone who understands how to be discreet and does not ask unnecessary questions." He paused, savoring the moment, waiting for me to show a sign of defeat. When I merely tilted my head, inviting him to continue, he pushed further, eager to twist the knife. "It was actually perfect timing," Jamal bragged, entirely oblivious to the fact that Attorney Sterling was sitting at the head of the table, absorbing every single word of this legally disastrous confession. The nurses had just given Grandpa a heavy dose of his pain medication. They were prepping him for one of those expensive treatments you were paying for. He was completely out of it, Nia. He barely knew what day it was, let alone what he was looking at. His eyes were glassy. He was floating in the clouds. Jamal laughed again, a harsh grating sound that bounced off the mahogany bookshelves. I walked into his suite, put a pen in his hand, and guided it right across the dotted line. I told him he was signing a release form for the hospital to upgrade his heart monitor. He did not even read it. He could not have read it even if he tried. He just nodded like a zombie and scribbled his name. And with that one signature, he revoked whatever ancient will Attorney Sterling had on file, and he left 100% of the Washington estate, every building, every bank account, every single asset, directly to me. I did not move a single muscle. I simply let the sheer, breathtaking magnitude of his stupidity wash over the room. He had just admitted out loud in a room with an officer of the court to coercing a heavily medicated, incapacitated elderly man into signing a fraudulent legal document under false pretenses. He had confessed to elder abuse, fraud, and coercion, and he was doing it with a massive, victorious smile on his face. Desmond let out a deep, rumbling laugh, finally recovering from the shock of his exposed financial ruin. He clapped Jamal hard on the shoulder, looking at me with an expression of supreme gloating triumph. You played a stupid game, Nia, my father taunted, shaking his head in mock pity. You really did. You spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of your hard-earned corporate money. You liquidated your stocks. You ruined your own financial portfolio just to keep that stubborn old man breathing a little longer. And for what? You kept him alive just long enough for Jamal to walk in and secure the paperwork at the finish line. My father leaned back, crossing his thick arms over his chest, his patriarchal arrogance fully restored. You did all the heavy lifting, Nia. You paid the bills, you paid the doctors, and you kept the asset alive. And your brother swooped in and took the prize. That is how the world works. The strong take what they want, and the weak pay for it. You think your MBA protects you from the real world. You think because you sit in a high-rise office reading spreadsheets that you understand power. Power is taking what is yours. You funded the hospital, but Jamal executed the deal. Tasha, who had been completely silent since discovering her husband's gambling debts, suddenly sat up straighter. The prospect of losing the $5 million bank loan had terrified her, but Jamal's confident proclamation that the will was ironclad seemed to reignite her reality television fantasies. She looked at Jamal with renewed admiration, instantly forgiving his financial treason in exchange for the promise of unearned wealth. You really outsmarted her, babe. Tasha cooed, reaching over to stroke Jamal's arm. She turned her gaze to me, her lips curling into a nasty, vindictive smirk. You see, Nia, this is what happens when you look down on people. You think your fancy degrees and your corporate titles make you untouchable. You think because you sit in boardrooms that you know how the real world operates. But street-level hustle beats corporate smarts every single time. Tasha laughed, a high-pitched grating sound that scraped against my ears. Nobody in Atlanta cares how you get the money, Nia. They only care that you have it. Jamal just played you for an absolute fool. He used your own money against you. He let you pay the medical bills while he secured the bag. That is brilliant. That is the kind of ruthless business instinct that is going to make our restaurant a massive success. You tried to play the good moral daughter. And where are you now? Sitting here with your fancy briefcase completely empty-handed. They were escalating, feeding off each other's delusion. They genuinely believed they had won. They believed that because Jamal had managed to secure a physical signature on a piece of paper, the entire legal system would simply bow to his hustle. They had no understanding of probate law, no concept of medical competency, and absolutely zero awareness of the catastrophic legal peril they were currently celebrating. Beatrice folded her hands neatly in her lap, looking at me with that sickening saccharine expression of false piety that made my skin crawl. God works in mysterious ways, Nia, my mother stated, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. You tried to steal your grandfather away from us. You tried to cut us out of his life and punish us. But the Lord saw to it that the rightful heir was restored. Jamal took initiative. He stepped up and claimed his birthright just like a real man should. And now, you are sitting here with nothing but empty bank accounts and a bruised ego. She gestured dismissively toward the heavy wooden door of the office. You can leave now. We have actual business to discuss with Attorney Sterling. We need to finalize the transfer of the commercial properties and authorize the release of the remaining funds to cover the funeral. You have no place here anymore. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair. I looked at Jamal, who was grinning like a lottery winner. I looked at Desmond, who was nodding in agreement with my mother's dismissal. I looked at Tasha, who was already mentally spending millions she would never possess. And finally, I looked at Attorney Sterling. The elderly lawyer had not moved or spoken during their entire self-incriminating tirade. He was sitting with his hands steepled under his chin, his eyes darting between me and the forged document on the table. He was a professional bound by ethics and law, and he had just witnessed a family gleefully confess to multiple felonies. He looked slightly pale, his jaw tight, but his eyes were locked on me, waiting for my signal. They were completely blind to the reality of the room. They were blinded by their own arrogance, their desperate greed, and their profound ignorance of how the world actually functioned outside of their fragile image-obsessed bubbles. They thought my corporate smarts were no match for their street-level manipulation. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner and won the game. The truth was, I had not even begun to play. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute silence stretch out for several long, agonizing seconds. I wanted them to feel the victory. I wanted them to taste it, to believe with every fiber of their being that they had conquered me. The higher they climbed on their pedestal of delusion, the more devastating the fall was going to be. "You are right about one thing, Jamal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, slicing through the triumphant atmosphere like a finely sharpened blade. I leaned forward, mirroring his aggressive posture but entirely devoid of his chaotic, desperate energy. I was the calm center of a hurricane they could not see coming. "You did find the facility in Houston," I acknowledged, keeping my tone deadly flat. "You did fly out there 6 months ago on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. You did bring a notary public, a man named Marcus Vance, whose license is currently under investigation by the Texas Secretary of State for fraudulent stamping, by the way. And you did walk into Ezekiel's room while he was heavily medicated on a dilaudid drip, following a minor surgical procedure to clear a blockage in his stent." Jamal's grin faltered slightly. The fact that I knew the exact day, the weather, the specific medication, and the status of his shady notary seemed to puncture a tiny hole in his armor. "And you are also right that you placed a pen in his hand and guided it across a piece of paper." I continued, my eyes never leaving his face. "You secured a signature. You got your ink. You told him it was a medical release form and he signed it." I paused, letting the silence stretch again. Tasha stopped stroking Jamal's arm, her hand falling back to her lap. Desmond frowned, sensing a massive shift in the air pressure, but unable to identify the incoming threat. Beatrice narrowed her eyes, her maternal instincts finally detecting severe danger. "But here's the thing about corporate smarts versus street-level manipulation," I said, my voice rising, just a fraction, filling the room with icy, absolute authority. "In the corporate world, we understand the concept of due diligence. We understand the chain of custody. We understand the precise legal definition of medical incompetency. And most importantly, we understand the difference between an asset and a liability." I reached back into my open designer briefcase, my fingers wrapping around the next stack of documents. Before my fingers could close around the next stack of documents hidden inside the silk-lined interior of my briefcase, Jamal lunged forward. The sudden jerky movement of his arm knocked his empty water glass over, sending it rolling harmlessly across the wood, but he did not care. He was desperate to intercept whatever momentum I was building. He had sensed the sudden drop in the room's temperature, and his fragile, unearned ego simply could not handle being outmaneuvered by a woman he considered his inferior. "Save your breath." Naya, Jamal barked, his voice straining to project a dominance he did not actually possess. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his flashy tailored suit and pulled out a stiff, folded legal document. He tossed it across the polished oak desk with a violent flick of his wrist. It slid with a quiet rasp, coming to a halt directly over the financial statements I had just pinned him with. "I do not care about your little corporate buzzwords," Jamal sneered, pointing a trembling finger at the paper. "I do not care about due diligence. I care about what is mine. Read it." I lowered my gaze to the document. The bold black lettering across the top of the page was unmistakable. It was a quitclaim deed. My blood ran cold, not out of fear, but out of a sudden profound realization of exactly how deeply the rot in this family went. This was not just Jamal's erratic greed. This was a calculated, predatory long con, and the architect of that con was sitting right next to him. I slowly turned my eyes to my father. Desmond Washington refused to look at me. He kept his eyes glued to the far wall, his thick jaw tight, displaying the classic cowardice of a man who lets others do his dirty work. 5 years ago, before I fully understood the depths of their financial depravity, I had purchased a luxury penthouse in Midtown Atlanta. It was a sprawling multi-million-dollar sanctuary in the sky, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, custom-imported marble countertops, private elevator access, and panoramic views of the city skyline. I had paid the massive down payment entirely with my own corporate bonuses. I paid every single mortgage premium, every exorbitant homeowners association fee, and every utility bill. It was my home, my safe haven away from their endless madness. But during the closing process, Desmond had slithered in. Playing the role of the caring, financially savvy patriarch, he had convinced me to exploit a highly obscure municipal tax loophole. He insisted that if I added grandfather Ezekiel to the deed as a non-contributing co-signer, his status as a decorated, elderly military veteran would shield the property from astronomical luxury property taxes. I had trusted my father. I had let him draw up the paperwork allowing Ezekiel's name to sit quietly next to mine, on the title completely unaware that I was inviting a vampire into my home. I now realized it had never been about a tax loophole. It had been a Trojan horse. Desmond knew my parents were going broke. He knew Ezekiel was aging rapidly. He had deliberately planted his father's name on my real estate asset, planting a ticking time bomb inside my financial portfolio. You recognize it, do you not? Jamal taunted, leaning heavily against the table, a hungry feral look in his eyes. Grandpa's name is on the deed to that gorgeous penthouse of yours. That means legally he owns 50% of it. And since I am the sole uncontested heir to his entire estate, that means I own half of your home. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over my side of the table. The sheer, breathtaking malice of the ambush pushed the boundaries of human greed. They were not just content with stealing the commercial properties and bankrupting our parents. They were actively trying to steal the home I bought with my own blood, sweat, and tears. So here is the deal, little sister Jamal commanded, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. You are going to take a pen, and you are going to sign that quitclaim deed right now. You are going to sign over your remaining 50% to me. You forfeit the property entirely. I stared at him, my face a mask of stone. And if I refuse? Jamal laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. If you refuse, I will use the estate's capital to force a partition sale. I will drag you through the courts, freeze your assets, and have you legally evicted by the sheriff. I will tie you up in litigation until your legal fees bankrupt you. Either way, you are losing that penthouse. But if you sign it over right now, I might just let you walk out of this office without completely destroying what is left of your life. Tasha gasped, not in horror, but in pure, unadulterated delight. The revelation that they could potentially seize a multi-million-dollar midtown penthouse was the ultimate adrenaline shot to her reality television dreams. She bounced in her seat, her diamond bracelets clanking noisily against the armrests. Jamal, that is brilliant! Tasha squealed, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. The penthouse. Do you know how perfect that is going to be for the show? The Auburn Avenue properties are great for the business storyline, but we need a luxury residence for the lifestyle shots. We can host the grand opening after-party there. Imagine the skyline views behind us while we film the high society dinner scenes. She turned to me, her face flushed with excitement and cruelty. Oh, Nia, do not be difficult about this. You know we need that space way more than you do. It fits our brand perfectly. You can just find a nice quiet little condo somewhere in the suburbs, somewhere more suited to your lifestyle. The complete lack of shame was staggering. They were openly plotting the theft and redecoration of my home right in front of me, treating my life as if it were an estate sale they were looting. Then my mother decided to deliver the final killing blow. Beatrice Washington had recovered from the shock of her exposed financial ruin. The opportunity to inflict pain on me, to strip me of my sanctuary, fueled her with a dark, renewed energy. She sat up straight, adjusting her designer knit suit, and fixed me with a stare so cold and devoid of maternal love it could have frozen water. You will be out by Friday, Beatrice ordered, her voice slicing through the room with absolute tyrannical authority. I did not flinch. Excuse me. You heard me? Nia? My mother sneered, her lips twisting into a vile, contemptuous smile. You will pack your bags, hire some movers, and be completely out of that penthouse by Friday afternoon. Jamal and Tasha have a launch party to plan, and they need time to redecorate that sterile, boring space you created. She leaned forward, dropping her voice into a vicious, hissing whisper meant to shatter my soul. Let us be completely honest with each other, Nia. What exactly are you doing with a 5,000-square-foot luxury penthouse anyway? You are 35 years old. You have no husband. You have no children. You are a single, barren woman who chose to worship a corporate ladder instead of building a family. A home like that is wasted on you. The cruelty of her words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. She was attacking the most vulnerable private spaces of my life, weaponizing my single status to justify stealing my property. Jamal and Tasha are building a legacy, Beatrice continued, gesturing proudly to my brother. They are going to give me grandchildren. They are going to carry the Washington name into the next generation. They deserve to live in a home that reflects their status and their future. You do not. You have failed your fundamental duties as a woman, Nia. So you will sign that deed. You will hand over the keys and you will leave. The audience in the room was pushed to the absolute limit of frustration by the relentless, suffocating greed. Attorney Sterling shifted violently in his heavy leather chair. The thick leather groaned under his weight as he physically recoiled from my mother's words. He had practiced trust and estate law for over 40 years. He had seen families tear each other apart over silver spoons and vacation cabins. But the sheer predatory depravity of the Washington family, the coordinated, joyful execution of their own daughter, was clearly testing the limits of his professional detachment. Sterling cleared his throat, a sharp, ragged sound, and reached for his glass of water, his eyes darting toward me. He was watching me closely, searching my face for the inevitable crack. He was waiting for the tears, the screaming, the total emotional collapse that any normal human being would suffer after being subjected to such a brutal, calculated betrayal. But I did not crack. I looked at the quitclaim deed resting on the table, the stark black lines of ink demanding the surrender of my sanctuary. I looked at Jamal's chest, puffed out in arrogant victory. I looked at Tasha, practically vibrating with excitement over stealing my home for a television show. I looked at Desmond, the cowardly architect of this trap, hiding behind his silence. And I looked at Beatrice, a mother so consumed by status and spite that she would gladly render her own daughter homeless. They had shown their entire hand. They had placed every single one of their chips on the table. They believed the forged will was their ultimate shield, and the quitclaim deed was their killing sword. They thought they possessed absolute leverage. I slowly let out a breath, feeling an unnatural, terrifying calm settle deep within my bones. The corporate executioner inside me was fully awake now. There would be no mercy. There would be no hesitation. They wanted to play a game of legal leverage, completely unaware that they had just handed the loaded gun directly to the person standing behind them. I reached my hand back into the open, silk-lined interior of my briefcase, my fingers finally closing around the thick stack of legal filings and injunctions I had brought with me. I reached my hand back into the open, silk-lined interior of my briefcase, my fingers finally closing around the thick stack of legal filings and injunctions I had brought with me. Before I could withdraw the documents, before I could drop the annihilating weight of federal and state reality onto the polished oak table, Tasha misinterpreted my momentary stillness. Her reality television instincts, honed by years of consuming manufactured drama and worshipping fake wealth, kicked into massive overdrive. She mistook my calculated restraint for the paralyzing grip of terror. She honestly believed that the combined threat of sudden homelessness and public ruin had finally broken my spirit. Tasha snatched her smartphone from the table with a sharp, aggressive movement. Her heavy acrylic nails tapped frantically against the glass screen. She held the device up high, pointing the camera lenses directly at my face, her thumb hovering aggressively over the screen. The ring light attachment she always carried illuminated, casting a harsh, bright glare across my features. "You think we are playing with you, Nia?" Tasha shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the mahogany bookshelves. "You think this is some kind of bluff? I have over 500,000 followers, and right now I am one tap away from going live to every single one of them. I am one tap away from showing all of Atlanta exactly who the great, untouchable Nia Washington really is." She waved the phone, the screen reflecting the manic, desperate energy burning in her eyes. "I am going to expose you to all of Black corporate Atlanta." Tasha threatened, her voice vibrating with a vicious, unearned authority. "I am going to tag your managing partners. I am going to tag the business journals. I will tag every single one of those high and mighty merger and acquisition executives you so desperately try to impress. I will show them the real you. A fraud. A broke, bitter, miserable fraud who is sitting in a lawyer's office refusing to sign a simple piece of paper because she is too selfish to help her own blood. I will tell them you kidnapped and tried to steal from your dying grandfather, and now you are trying to steal the estate from your brother. Her voice rose to a fever pitch, intoxicated by her own perceived power and the thrill of the ultimate call-out. "Your M&A career will be completely finished." Nia, Tasha spat, stepping closer to my chair. "You will never close another major deal in this city. You will be a walking corporate liability. Prestigious firms do not hire women who get dragged on the internet for elder abuse and financial fraud. You will be blacklisted before the broadcast even ends. Sign the quitclaim deed right now, or I swear to God I will hit this button and burn your entire professional life to the ground." The introduction of the camera acted like a lit match thrown into a pool of gasoline. The sight of Tasha actively threatening my total public ruin emboldened the rest of the room. My family descended into an absolute chaotic frenzy of demands. The sophisticated, dignified veneer of a formal legal proceeding vanished entirely, replaced by the ugly, visceral roar of a pack of starving wolves fighting over a scrap of meat. "Sign the paper," Jamal yelled, leaning halfway across the table, spittle flying from his lips. His face was flushed, his eyes wild with the desperate clawing need to secure the multi-million-dollar asset that would save him from his creditors. "Sign the damn paper and get out of my penthouse. You lost the game, Nia. Accept it. You are nothing without the protection of this family. You are a complete failure. Write the check for the funeral," my mother screamed, her voice cutting through Jamal's booming demands like shattered glass. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her face contorted with years of simmering, unhinged resentment. "Write the check and sign the deed. Submit to your family. Stop being so incredibly stubborn and arrogant. You owe us. You have always owed us. You are a disappointment. You have always been a massive disappointment, and this is your last chance to make it right." My father slammed his heavy fist against the table again, the violent thud rattling the crystal water glasses and vibrating up through my armrests. "Do as you are told," Desmond bellowed, reverting completely to the toxic, authoritarian tone he had used to terrorize our household throughout my childhood. "Stop fighting us. You have been entirely outplayed. Put your signature on that line. Hand over the keys to the property and get out of our sight. You are a failure, Nia. Accept your place. Sign it. Pay it. Submit. Fail." Their voices overlapped, tangling together into a deafening toxic crescendo. They were all shouting at me at once, a unified chorus of pure, unadulterated hatred, entitlement, and greed. They demanded my total surrender. They demanded my financial ruin. They demanded I accept the role of the family scapegoat, the sacrificial lamb to be slaughtered on the altar of Jamal's fake real estate empire, and my parents' desperate bankrupt pride. The noise in the office was staggering. Attorney Sterling had pressed himself as far back into his heavy leather chair as physically possible, his face a portrait of absolute professional horror. He looked like a man watching a multi-car pileup unfold in agonizing slow motion. He watched the shouting, he watched the phone camera aimed aggressively at my face, he watched the forged document and the quitclaim deed sitting on his desk, and he watched me. I sat perfectly motionless in the center of the storm. I did not reach for the pen. I did not flinch from the bright, blinding glare of Tasha's phone. I did not shrink away from my father's booming voice or my mother's vicious, targeted insults. Instead, I simply looked at them. I looked at Tasha, desperate for internet clout, holding a smartphone like a loaded weapon. I looked at Jamal, sweating and panicked, begging for a piece of real estate he could never afford to maintain. I looked at Desmond, a hollow, broken patriarch trying to bully his way out of a self-inflicted bankruptcy. And I looked at Beatrice, a mother so consumed by vanity and optics that she would gladly render her own daughter homeless to protect a lie. I absorbed every single ounce of their hatred, every drop of their venom, and I felt a profound, absolute release. The invisible chains of familial obligation, the lingering, suffocating guilt of the dutiful daughter, the quiet, pathetic hope that they might one day wake up and see my worth it all evaporated. It was gone, burned away by the sheer, undeniable heat of their betrayal. And then, something extraordinary happened. As the cacophony of their screaming reached its absolute peak, as Tasha's manicured finger hovered a millimeter above the record button on her screen, my corporate mask finally shifted. I looked directly into the lens of Tasha's camera. I held the gaze of whatever invisible audience she thought she was commanding. Then I slowly shifted my eyes to my brother, to my mother, and to my father. I began to smile. It did not start as a smirk or a polite defensive grin. It started deep within me, a physical manifestation of the absolute crushing victory I was about to unleash upon them. The corners of my mouth curled upward, stretching into a wide, bright, terrifyingly genuine smile. It was not the smile of a defeated woman begging for mercy. It was the smile of an apex predator that had just watched its prey willingly walk into a sealed steel cage and lock the door from the inside. It was a smile that radiated absolute chilling supremacy. My family saw the smile, and the effect was instantaneous. It was as if I had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The screaming began to falter, stumbling over the sudden jarring visual of my absolute joy. Jamal's mouth hung open, his aggressive posture freezing in midair. He blinked rapidly, profound confusion warring with the blind panic in his eyes. Why was I smiling? Why was the victim baring her teeth? Beatrice stopped mid-sentence, the cruel insult dying on her lips. She stared at me, her face turning a sickly shade of gray, her maternal instincts finally screaming that she had made a catastrophic, fatal error. Desmond's heavy fist hovered over the table, slowly lowering as the unnatural beaming calm of my expression short-circuited his rage. Even Tasha, completely oblivious to the nuances of human emotion, slowly lowered her smartphone. The threat of her live stream suddenly felt incredibly small, incredibly foolish, and incredibly dangerous in the face of my towering amusement. The ring light dipped toward the floor, casting long, warped shadows across the mahogany. The deafening roar of the Washington family fell away, replaced by a thick, heavy, terrifying silence. The air in the office grew stagnant and cold. They were staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. They were waiting for the breakdown, waiting for the tears, waiting for the desperate pleas for forgiveness. And instead, they were met with the serene, joyful composure of a woman holding a royal flush. I let the silence stretch. I let it wrap around their throats and tighten. I let their confusion curdle into genuine, unadulterated dread. I maintained my wide, chilling smile, making sure to make direct, unblinking eye contact with each of them one last time. I wanted this moment burned into their memories forever. I wanted them to remember the exact second they realized they had lost absolutely everything. Finally, I turned my head away from my frozen, terrified family. I shifted my gaze to the head of the table. Attorney Sterling sat up a fraction of an inch, his hands still steepled, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He recognized the shift. He knew the theatrical prelude was over, and the legal execution was about to begin. I kept the smile on my face, my voice ringing out clear, crisp, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Attorney Sterling," I said smoothly, cutting through the dead air of the office, "I believe it is time we discuss the actual estate." The room fell dead silent. The heavy, oppressive silence stretched across the mahogany desk, thick and palpable. For the first time since this disastrous meeting began, nobody was screaming. Nobody was pointing fingers. The frantic, desperate energy that had been radiating from my parents and my brother evaporated, replaced by a sudden, chilling uncertainty. My wide, unblinking smile had completely short-circuited their momentum. They were waiting for an explosion, a breakdown, a surrender. Instead, they were staring at a woman who looked like she had just been handed the keys to the world. Attorney Sterling exhaled a long, measured breath. The sound was incredibly loud in the quiet office. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his expression transitioning from silent horror to absolute clinical professionalism. He had witnessed the depravity. He had allowed them to hang themselves with their own arrogant confessions. Now it was his turn to execute the law. Sterling reached across his massive desk. His hand, weathered and spotted with age, moved with deliberate, agonizing slowness. He placed his palm flat over Jamal's fraudulent, stapled document. He did not snatch it. He did not throw it back. He simply slid it into the open manila folder that had housed the previous outdated will. He closed the cardboard cover with a soft, definitive smack. Then Sterling reached down toward the floor beside his chair. The brass clasps of his heavy, worn leather briefcase clicked open, the metallic sound echoing sharply against the wood-paneled walls. He reached inside and used both hands to extract a massive, imposing binder. The binder was thick-bound in dark blue leather and secured with a heavy official red seal that immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the room. He hoisted it onto the center of his desk. The sheer weight of the document produced a deep, resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Jamal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Tasha leaned forward, her eyes darting between the massive binder and Sterling's impassive face. Beatrice clutched her designer handbag tighter against her chest, her knuckles turning bone white. Desmond's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. They all recognized the physical weight of authority resting on that desk, but their blinding arrogance refused to let them understand what it meant for them. Sterling folded his hands precisely over the top of the blue binder. He turned his gaze directly to my brother. "Mr. Washington?" Attorney Sterling began, his voice dropping into a register that was entirely professional, perfectly polite, and dripping with an absolute terrifying finality. "I have listened to your statements today. I have reviewed the document you presented to this office. I have noted the date of execution, the presence of a notary public's seal, and the signature of your late grandfather, Ezekiel Washington." Jamal sat up a fraction of an inch, a glimmer of desperate hope reigniting in his eyes. He glanced at Tasha, who was practically holding her breath, waiting for the legal blessing that would make her rich. "As an officer of the court and the executor of this estate, it is my duty to interpret the legal standing of all documents presented before me." Sterling continued, his tone unwavering. "The laws of the state of Georgia regarding the probate of estates are incredibly clear on matters of succession and final directives." Sterling paused, letting his gaze sweep across the desperate, hungry faces of my family. "Therefore, I must confirm to you today that the document you procured in Houston 6 months ago meets the basic statutory requirements for a final directive." Sterling stated, his voice echoing clearly off the high ceiling. "It bears the signature of the deceased. It is stamped by a commissioned notary. Under the strict interpretation of the law, a newer will, provided it is properly signed and witnessed, supersedes and revokes all previous wills and testaments drawn up prior to its execution date." Sterling looked Jamal dead in the eye. "The document you forced your grandfather to sign is in fact legally binding. It revokes the previous division of assets. It centralizes the entirety of the Washington estate under one name. You are, legally speaking, the sole and uncontested heir to everything Ezekiel Washington possessed at the time of his death." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Jamal let out a deafening, guttural roar of absolute victory. He leapt out of his leather chair, the heavy piece of furniture scraping violently backward against the hardwood floor. He threw his arms up into the air, his fists clenched in pure, unadulterated triumph. He spun around and slapped his hand against Tasha's in a massive, echoing high five. "We did it," Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with sheer adrenaline. "We got the bag. I told you. I told all of you." Tasha was practically vibrating, bouncing on her toes as she clutched Jamal's arm. She let out a high-pitched, piercing shriek of joy, her eyes wide with the realization of her wildest, most materialistic fantasies. "We are rich!" she squealed, jumping up and down. "We are getting the restaurant. We are getting the penthouse. We are going to be the biggest stars on the network. I told you we were smarter than her babe. I told you." Across the table, the celebration was equally nauseating. Beatrice threw her hands up toward the ceiling, her eyes squeezed shut, in an offensive display of manufactured religious fervor. "Hallelujah," my mother shouted, her voice trembling with vindictive joy. "Praise the Lord for his divine justice. He saw the wickedness in this room, and he restored the rightful order. He protected this family from the devil." Desmond let out a deep, rumbling laugh of absolute relief. The crushing weight of his catastrophic financial ruin had just been lifted off his shoulders by the stroke of a pen. He leaned back in his chair, running a thick hand over his face, before fixing me with a look of pure, concentrated disgust. "You hear that, Nia?" my father taunted, his voice booming over the chaotic cheering of my brother and sister-in-law. "You hear the law talking. You lost. You played your little corporate games, you tried to steal from your own blood, and you got absolutely nothing. You are walking out of here with zero. Jamal is the head of this family now. He owns the buildings. He owns the accounts. He owns the penthouse. You have until Friday to get your things out of his property before I personally come over there and throw your designer bags onto the sidewalk." They were utterly lost in their delusion. They were celebrating a victory they had not actually won, blinded by a legal technicality that they lacked the intellectual capacity to truly understand. They were dancing on the grave of a man they had neglected, cheering for money they thought they had stolen, and mocking the very person who held the remote control to the detonator. I did not break my smile. I did not blink. I simply remained seated, my hands resting lightly on my lap, watching them perform their grotesque dance of unearned victory. I let them cheer. I let my mother praise a god she only invoked for financial gain. I let my father threaten to evict me from my own home. I let Jamal and Tasha plan a future they would never ever see. I let them reach the absolute pinnacle of their joy. At the head of the table, Attorney Sterling watched the spectacle with a look of profound, chilling pity. He did not yell over the noise. He did not bang his hand on the desk. He simply waited for the initial shockwave of their celebration to recede. Slowly, deliberately, Sterling raised his right hand. It was a small, quiet gesture, but it carried the absolute weight of the law. The movement caught Desmond's eye first. My father stopped laughing, his heavy brow furrowing in confusion. He nudged Beatrice, who lowered her hands from the ceiling, her praises dying in her throat. Jamal and Tasha, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy, stopped their frantic jumping. Jamal turned back to the desk, breathing heavily, a massive, arrogant grin still plastered across his sweating face. "What is it?" Sterling Jamal asked, his tone entirely disrespectful, treating the seasoned attorney like an employee he had just hired. "You need me to sign the transfer papers right now. Because my pen is ready. Let us get these accounts liquidated. I have contractors waiting to break ground on my new restaurant." Attorney Sterling lowered his hand. He adjusted his glasses once more, his eyes locking onto Jamal with a look so intensely serious that it instantly stripped the grin from my brother's face. The room plunged back into a heavy, suffocating silence. Sterling rested his hands on top of the blue, red-sealed binder. "Yes," Jamal Attorney Sterling stated, his voice ringing out with crystal-clear, devastating precision. "Based on the document you coerced your grandfather into signing, you are indeed the sole, uncontested heir to Ezekiel Washington's estate." Sterling paused. He took a single, agonizingly slow breath, letting the anticipation twist like a knife in their guts. However, Sterling continued, his tone dropping into a register of absolute terrifying reality. "It is my strict legal and professional duty to inform you of the current status of the assets you believe you have just claimed." Sterling leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms against the heavy binder. "You have won the estate, Jamal, but you have inherited an empty estate." The words hung in the air, heavy, cold, and utterly incomprehensible to the four people sitting across from me. The absolute silence in the office was no longer tense. It was a vacuum entirely devoid of oxygen. Jamal's face went completely blank. His jaw went slack, his eyes blinking rapidly as his brain desperately tried to process the sequence of words that had just left the attorney's mouth. He looked at the blue binder, then at Sterling, and finally his panicked gaze flicked over to me. My smile had not wavered. It had only grown colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. What Jamal stammered, his voice cracking the booming arrogance of seconds ago, entirely vanished. "What are you talking about? What do you mean an empty estate? He left everything to me. You just said it. You just said I own the buildings, I own the accounts, I own the penthouse. It is mine." Tasha clutched Jamal's arm again, but this time her grip was frantic, her fingernails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. "Wait, what does he mean, Jamal? Make him explain it. What does he mean empty?" Beatrice slowly lowered herself back into her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and aged. Desmond gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white, a look of profound, dawning terror washing over his features. He was a man who understood the brutal reality of bankruptcy, and he recognized the scent of total financial annihilation filling the room. Attorney Sterling did not look away from Jamal. He tapped the thick cover of the blue binder with his index finger. I mean exactly what I said, Mr. Washington Sterling replied, his voice a steady, unrelenting drumbeat of doom. You hold the legal rights to the Washington estate. But as of this morning at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, the Washington estate holds absolutely zero assets. There are no commercial properties. There are no checking accounts. There are no investment portfolios. And there is certainly no ownership claim to your sister's penthouse. Jamal took a staggering step back, hitting the edge of his leather chair. No, he whispered, shaking his head frantically. No, that is impossible. That is illegal. He owned 5 commercial buildings on Auburn Avenue. He had millions in the bank. You cannot just erase that. Where is the money, Sterling? Where is the property? Sterling slowly unclasped the brass locks on the blue binder. He flipped the heavy leather cover open, revealing hundreds of pages of densely packed complex legal and corporate filings. The assets were not erased, Jamal Sterling explained, turning the first page over with a soft rustle of paper. They were simply relocated. And they were relocated with absolute flawless legal precision long before you ever walked into that Houston facility with a fraudulent notary. The silence in the room was absolute. Jamal stared at Attorney Sterling, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked at the heavy blue binder resting on the desk, then back to the older lawyer, his brain entirely unable to bridge the massive yawning gap between his perceived victory and this sudden catastrophic roadblock. Desmond's face twisted into a mask of pure panic. He pushed his chair back, his heavy boots scraping harshly against the floorboards. What do you mean relocated? Desmond demanded, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. You cannot just relocate real estate, Sterling. Those buildings are made of brick and mortar. They sit on Auburn Avenue. Ezekiel owned them for 40 years. He owned the family house in Buckhead. He had 7 figures in his primary checking account at Fidelity. You cannot just magically erase decades of accumulated wealth. Jamal slammed his hands onto the desk, leaning over it, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched collar. He is lying, Jamal shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the attorney. He is covering for her. This is a trick. The will says I get everything. I am the sole heir. You cannot have an empty estate when the man practically owned half the block. Where are the deeds, Sterling? Where are the account numbers? Beatrice was shaking her head violently, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place. This is a game, she muttered, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles looked ready to burst through the skin. Nia is playing one of her wicked corporate games. She paid him off. She paid the lawyer to lie to us. I let them flail. I watched them drown in their own ignorance, their voices bouncing off the mahogany walls in a frantic, uncoordinated symphony of denial. They were clinging to their greed so desperately they could not even see the massive legal freight train bearing down on them. I reached across the desk and gently placed my hand flat on top of the blue binder. The sound of my palm hitting the leather acted like a gunshot. Everyone froze. All 4 of them snapped their heads toward me, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate clinging hope that I was somehow bluffing. I am going to explain this to you very slowly, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, lethal register. I am going to use small words so that even you, Jamal, can understand exactly how badly you have ruined your own life. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I shifted entirely out of the role of the betrayed daughter and stepped fully into the skin of the ruthless mergers and acquisitions executive they so deeply resented. Let us talk about probate. I began, locking eyes with my brother. Probate is the legal process of administering a person's estate after they die. When you walked into that Houston facility 6 months ago and forced a heavily medicated man to sign a fraudulent document, you thought you were playing 3-dimensional chess. You thought you had secured the golden ticket, but you do not even know the basic rules of the board you are playing on. Jamal swallowed hard, a heavy bead of sweat tracing its way down his temple. The will says I get everything, he repeated, though his voice lacked any of its previous conviction. It sounded like a desperate plea. A will, I instructed, my voice slicing through the air like a scalpel, only governs the assets that are physically and legally held in a person's individual name at the exact precise second their heart stops beating. A will is nothing more than a set of instructions for the probate court telling a judge how to distribute the personal property of the deceased. I tapped the blue binder beneath my hand. 2 years ago, I continued when you three abandoned him in that Atlanta hospital to suffocate on his own failing heart. I did not just hire a medical transport team. I did not just buy him top-tier cardiac care and a luxury rehabilitation suite in Texas. I bought him time. And during that time, while his body healed and his mind cleared, we had several very long, very honest conversations about this family. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. You manipulated him, Beatrice whispered, her eyes wide with horror. You poisoned him against us. I showed him your palliative care orders. Beatrice, I shot back, my voice cracking like a whip. I showed him the paperwork where you authorized the hospital to pull the plug so you could pay off Desmond's bad investments and Jamal's bookies. He did not need to be poisoned against you. He saw you exactly for what you are. And once he realized that his legacy, the empire he spent his entire life building from the ground up, was going to be liquidated by a pack of greedy vultures. The second he closed his eyes, he asked me to protect it. Desmond's chest was heaving. What did you do? Nia, my father growled, his voice trembling with an emotion that sounded dangerously close to pure terror. I did what I do best, Desmond. I stated, a cold, predatory smile returning to my lips. I execute corporate restructuring. I oversee mergers, acquisitions, and asset protection for multi-billion-dollar conglomerates. Do you honestly think I would leave my grandfather's life work sitting in a vulnerable personal account, waiting for you parasites to bleed it dry? I opened the thick blue binder and pulled out the first stack of heavy watermarked documents. I slid them across the table, fanning them out, so they could all see the state seals and the dense blocks of legal text. When I flew him to Houston, I did not just bring cardiologists. I explained, watching their eyes dart frantically over the paperwork. I brought in top-tier corporate attorneys. I brought in trust and estate specialists. I brought in forensic accountants. We spent 6 months executing a massive, airtight financial restructuring of the entire Washington portfolio. Jamal reached out with a trembling hand and pulled one of the documents toward him. His eyes scanned the page, his lips moving silently as he tried to decipher the complex corporate jargon. We created a series of irrevocable living trusts. I continued, my voice steady and relentless. We established a Delaware-based limited liability company to act as a holding firm for all commercial real estate. Every single brick on Auburn Avenue, every storefront, every residential lease was legally transferred out of Ezekiel Washington's personal name and deeded directly to the holding company. Tasha let out a small, terrified squeak. Her hands flew to her mouth, her reality television dreams dissolving into dust before her eyes. We did not stop at the real estate. I pressed on, refusing to give them a single second to breathe. We transferred every liquid asset, the Fidelity checking accounts, the mutual funds, the municipal bonds. Every single penny was wired into the irrevocable trusts. Even the Buckhead family home was deeded into a specific residential trust. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, watching the absolute devastation take hold of my family. By the time you managed to track him down 6 months ago, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper, Ezekiel Washington was a penniless man on paper. He did not own a single commercial building. He did not own a bank account. He did not even own the bed he was sleeping in. He had legally, voluntarily, and permanently stripped himself of all personal assets to protect them from you. Desmond grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning entirely white. He looked like he was going to vomit. You stole it, he gasped, his voice barely functional. You transferred it all to yourself. Wrong again, Desmond Attorney Sterling interjected, his voice dry and clinical. As the executor of the newly formed holding companies and trusts, I can assure you, Nia Washington did not transfer a single asset into her own name. She simply facilitated the creation of the corporate entities. Ezekiel Washington named the beneficiaries of those trusts himself, and none of the beneficiaries are sitting in this room. Jamal dropped the document he was holding. It fluttered to the desk, landing softly on top of the pile. He stared at his trembling hands, his mind completely broken by the sheer scale of his failure. You hold a perfectly legal document, Jamal, I said, bringing his attention back to me. You successfully committed fraud, coercion, and elder abuse to secure a signature that makes you the sole heir to Ezekiel Washington's personal estate. But Ezekiel died with exactly $0 and zero properties to his name. I leaned forward, delivering the final crushing truth. Your forged will is completely valid, Jamal, and it entitles you to absolutely nothing. You inherited 100% of a ghost. You own an empty estate. The silence that followed was different from any silence before it. It was not tense. It was the silence of a graveyard. It was the sound of a total, irreversible defeat. Tasha was the first to break. She let out a loud, ugly sob, burying her face in her hands, the reality of her husband's massive gambling debts crashing down on her. Desmond slumped forward, burying his face in his heavy hands, his patriarchal pride utterly shattered. Beatrice simply stared blankly at the wall, her mind unable to accept that her golden child had been outplayed so thoroughly and so brutally. Jamal looked at me, his eyes hollow and defeated. He had nothing left to say. He had no threats, no leverage, no swagger. He was a ruined man holding a worthless piece of paper. And yet, despite the absolute destruction of their plans, I looked down at the quitclaim deed still resting on the table. They had demanded my home. They had tried to render me homeless just minutes prior. I placed my finger on the edge of the deed and slowly pushed it back across the desk toward my brother. The crisp, heavy parchment of the quitclaim deed slid across the polished mahogany wood with a soft, scraping whisper. It came to a rest exactly 2 inches from Jamal's trembling fingertips. He stared at the forged document as if it had suddenly burst into flames. His chest heaved with shallow, frantic breaths, his mind entirely unable to process the magnitude of the legal wall he had just crashed into. Beside me, Attorney Sterling leaned forward. The atmosphere in the office had shifted from a circus of greedy anticipation to the clinical, sterile environment of a corporate autopsy. Sterling bypassed the standard manila folders and rested his hands firmly on the massive blue leather binder sitting in the center of his desk. He reached for a silver letter opener resting near his pen set and slid the blade under the thick official red wax seal securing the binder's clasp. The seal cracked with a sharp, definitive snap. Let us turn our attention to the actual governing documents of the Washington estate. Sterling announced, his voice echoing with absolute, uncompromising authority. He flipped back the heavy leather cover, revealing a title page printed on thick archival quality paper. What you are looking at is the master file for the Ezekiel Legacy Irrevocable Trust, Sterling stated, reading the bold black letters at the top of the page. This legal entity was established, notarized, and fully funded exactly 24 months ago. It predates your forged Houston will by a year and a half. Jamal blinked rapidly, his eyes darting frantically between Sterling and the thick stack of papers. A trust. He stammered, his voice cracking, dripping with desperate, uneducated defiance. I do not care about a trust. I have a will. A newer will revokes older documents. You said that yourself 5 minutes ago. A will is the final word on an estate. My paper beats your paper. I let out a soft, echoing laugh. It was a cold, razor-sharp sound that made Tasha physically flinch in her seat. You truly do not understand the game you are playing, Jamal, I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the desk. You walked into a high-stakes corporate arena armed with a basic Google search and a criminal notary. Allow me to educate you on the reality of asset shielding. I locked eyes with my brother, letting him see the full terrifying weight of the trap I had built for him. A will only governs probate assets, I explained, utilizing the precise surgical tone I reserved for dismantling hostile corporate acquisitions. Probate is the legal process of deciding who gets what a dead man owned. But an irrevocable trust is entirely different. An irrevocable trust is a living, breathing legal fiction. It is a separate entity entirely. It bypasses probate completely. When a person transfers their assets into an irrevocable trust, they legally no longer own those assets. The trust owns them. Desmond's heavy jaw dropped open, a look of profound, sickening comprehension finally washing over his features. He understood the mechanics of hiding money. He realized instantly what had been done. Therefore, I continued, my voice steady and unrelenting. A will cannot touch it. A will cannot alter it. A will cannot challenge it. The document you forced grandfather to sign dictates the distribution of his personal property. But because of this trust, Ezekiel Washington died with absolutely no personal property to distribute. Your will is a sword swinging at empty air. Sterling turned the page of the binder, the sound loud in the dead silence of the room. He ran his index finger down a long, itemized schedule of assets attached to the trust declaration. Ms. Washington is entirely correct. Sterling confirmed his tone professional and merciless. 24 months ago, Ezekiel Washington, acting as the grantor, legally transferred the deeds to all 5 commercial properties on Auburn Avenue into the Ezekiel Legacy Irrevocable Trust. On that same day, he transferred ownership of the Buckhead family estate into the trust. The following week, the entirety of his liquid assets, including his primary checking accounts, his mutual fund portfolios, and his municipal bonds, were wired directly into the trust's holding accounts. Beatrice let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked as though she were staring at a ghost. "The Buckhead house," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "You put the house we live in into a trust. We do not own our home. You have not owned that home for 2 years, Mother," I replied coldly. "You have been living in a property owned and managed by a corporate entity." Jamal slammed both of his fists onto the table, the sheer force rattling Sterling's crystal water glasses. "But who gets it?" Jamal bellowed, spittle flying from his lips as blind panic completely consumed him. "If the trust owns the buildings, who owns the trust? It has to be divided. It has to go to the family. That is how this works." He was a traditional man. He would have divided it equally among his bloodline. Attorney Sterling did not flinch at the outburst. He simply adjusted his glasses and turned to the 3rd page of the binder. "An irrevocable trust operates under the strict governance of its appointed trustee." Sterling explained, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. "The trustee is the individual granted absolute, unmitigated legal control over the management, sale, and distribution of every single asset held within the entity. They possess the sole fiduciary authority to execute the wishes of the grantor." Sterling looked up, his gaze sweeping past Jamal, past my horrified parents, and landing squarely on me. "Under the terms established by Ezekiel Washington," Sterling read aloud, his voice booming with finality, "Nia Washington is named as the sole independent trustee of the Ezekiel Legacy Irrevocable Trust." Tasha let out a loud, ugly sob. She buried her face in her hands, her acrylic nails digging into her scalp as the reality of her husband's massive, inescapable gambling debts crashed down upon her. She had banked her entire future, her survival, on this inheritance. Now she was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. But Sterling was not finished. He raised his hand slightly, demanding silence to deliver the ultimate annihilating blow. Furthermore, Sterling continued, the volume of his voice rising over Tasha's muffled crying. "An irrevocable trust must designate a beneficiary, the individual or entity entitled to the financial benefits, yields, and ultimate distributions of the trust's assets." Jamal froze. He stopped breathing entirely, his eyes glued to Sterling's lips, praying for a miracle that was never going to come. Desmond gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that the leather creaked under the strain. Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Declaration. Sterling read, enunciating every single syllable with devastating clarity. "The grantor hereby names Nia Washington as the sole exclusive beneficiary of the Ezekiel Legacy Irrevocable Trust." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of total, irreversible destruction. The Washington family empire, the commercial buildings, the million-dollar accounts, the sprawling suburban mansion, it had all been legally sealed inside an impenetrable vault. And I was the only person on Earth who held the combination. They were financially obliterated. Jamal's legs finally gave out. He collapsed backward into his heavy leather chair, his body going completely limp. He stared blankly at the ceiling, his mind broken by the sheer scale of his failure. He had lied. He had schemed. He had committed a felony to steal an empire, only to discover that the empire had been packed up and moved away years before he even thought to strike. Beatrice was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated dread. She recognized the monster she had created. She saw the ruthless, calculating predator I had become in order to survive their constant betrayals. Desmond refused to look at me. He stared down at his heavy hands, the patriarchal pride he had lorded over us for decades entirely stripped away. He was a bankrupt man sitting in a house he did not own at the mercy of a daughter he had relentlessly belittled. I let them suffer in the silence for a long, agonizing minute. I wanted the reality of their situation to sink deep into their bones. I wanted them to feel the precise, suffocating terror of absolute powerlessness. Slowly, I reached out and tapped my index finger against the forged quitclaim deed still resting on the desk in front of Jamal. The soft tapping sound drew my brother's hollow, defeated gaze back down to the table. He looked at the paper he had slammed down with such arrogance just 20 minutes ago. "You were very loud when you demanded my home, Jamal," I said, my voice smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You told me I had until Friday to pack my things. You told me you were going to throw my designer bags onto the sidewalk. You waved this piece of paper in my face and told me to sign over my penthouse." Jamal swallowed hard, unable to formulate a single word. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, watching the executioner pull the lever. I picked up the quitclaim deed and held it up to the light. "The problem with your little extortion attempt," I explained, looking at Tasha, whose phone was now lying face down and forgotten on the mahogany wood, "is that you cannot force someone to sign over an asset they do not technically own." I tossed the paper back onto the desk. It landed with a pathetic, fluttery slap. When I restructured grandfather's assets 2 years ago, I stated, locking eyes with my brother, I made sure to protect my own portfolio. "I am a mergers and acquisitions executive, Jamal. I shield multi-million-dollar corporate entities for a living. Do you honestly think I would leave my primary residence exposed to a family of financial parasites?" Desmond's head snapped up, his eyes widening in fresh horror. 24 months ago, I continued delivering the final, inescapable checkmate. The deed to my downtown penthouse was transferred into the Ezekiel Legacy Irrevocable Trust. I own it completely. It is shielded by the exact same legal ironclad that protects Auburn Avenue and the Buckhead estate. You cannot claim it. You cannot force a transfer. You have no legal right to a single brick, a single window, or a single square inch of my property. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap, radiating absolute, chilling supremacy. "Your forged will is useless, Jamal," I concluded, my voice ringing with an undeniable, victorious finality. "Your quitclaim deed is garbage. Your threats are empty. You walked into this room believing you were the king of an empire. But the truth is, you are nothing but a trespasser sitting in my kingdom, and you have absolutely nothing left to play." Jamal could not breathe. The oxygen in the room seemed to have been entirely consumed by the crushing weight of his failure. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles straining against his dark skin, pulling himself forward, as if trying to anchor his body to the earth. A harsh, ragged, wheezing sound tore through his throat. His chest heaved in violent, erratic spasms. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit, a loophole, a savior that did not exist. Beatrice surged forward, her maternal instincts momentarily overriding her shock. She reached out, grasping Jamal by the shoulder. "Breathe, Jamal," she urged, her voice shrill with rising panic. "Just breathe. It is a misunderstanding. We will hire our own lawyers. We will fight this trust. We will take her to court." My father did not move. Desmond remained frozen in his chair, staring at Jamal with a look of absolute, paralyzing dread. He knew better. He knew that you could not fight a properly executed, irrevocable trust, especially not one managed by someone with my resources. He watched his son gasping for air, fully realizing that the Washington family was not just broke, but entirely broken. I sat perfectly still, letting Jamal's ragged breathing fill the silence. I watched Beatrice desperately rubbing his back. I watched Tasha staring at her husband as if he had suddenly transformed into a monster. "You think the loss of the estate is the worst thing that happened to you today, Jamal?" I asked, my voice cutting through the sound of his hyperventilation like a blade. You think walking out of this office with empty pockets is your biggest problem? Jamal forced his head up. His eyes were bloodshot sweat pouring down his face and soaking into the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling cough emerged. I reached down into the open interior of my silk-lined briefcase. My fingers brushed past the legal filings for the trust and closed around a thin, plain manila folder. I pulled it out and dropped it onto the center of the desk, right next to his worthless quitclaim deed. The folder landed with a soft, unassuming slap, but it carried the destructive force of a live grenade. I am a professional, Jamal. I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion, entirely clinical and cold. I do not deal in threats, I deal in execution. And when you decided to walk into my home and brag about your newly acquired wealth, you made a catastrophic, fatal error. I opened the folder. Inside was a stack of crisp, freshly printed financial documents stamped with the logo of a prominent commercial lending institution headquartered in downtown Atlanta. I turned the documents around so they faced my brother. You could not just wait for the probate process, could you? I said, leaning forward. You were so desperate for cash, so eager to fund your ridiculous lifestyle and pay off your creditors, that you took your fraudulent Houston will straight to the bank. Jamal's eyes locked onto the logo at the top of the page. The last remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His mouth fell open, a silent scream dying in his throat. You used a 6-month-old, unprobated will as proof of asset ownership, I explained, making sure every single word was enunciated with crystal-clear precision. You walked into a commercial lending office, and you leveraged properties you believed you were going to inherit. You applied for a $5 million commercial line of credit, using the 5 buildings on Auburn Avenue as collateral. Desmond let out a choked, horrifying gasp. What did you do? He roared, his voice cracking with pure terror as he turned on his son. You leveraged the buildings. You took out a loan against the commercial properties before the will was even read. Jamal shrank back, pressing himself into his chair, trying to get as far away from the documents as physically possible. I had to, he stammered, his voice weak and pathetic. I had deadlines. The contractors for the restaurant needed a deposit. My investors were pulling out. The loan officer said the will was enough proof of impending transfer. He said he could advance the funds if I signed a pledge against the deeds. I smiled, a wide, terrifying expression of absolute victory. And that, Jamal, is the fatal flaw in your entire master plan, I said, my voice echoing off the walls. Because you did not own those buildings. Ezekiel Washington did not own those buildings. The Ezekiel Legacy Irrevocable Trust owned those buildings. And you just pledged $5 million against assets that belong to a corporate entity you have absolutely zero legal connection to. Tasha stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. No, she whimpered, shaking her head. No, Jamal, tell me you did not sign those papers. Tell me you did not take the money. I took the money, Jamal whispered, tears welling in his eyes. I transferred it to the restaurant accounts yesterday. I paid the contractors. I paid off the debts. I needed the cash, Tasha. I had to do it, too. I tapped my fingernail against his signature on the bottom of the loan agreement. Do you know what the federal government calls it when you secure a multi-million-dollar loan using assets you do not legally own, Jamal? I asked, my voice a deadly quiet whisper. He did not answer. He just stared at his signature, tears spilling over his eyelashes and tracking through the sweat on his cheeks. It is called mortgage fraud, I stated, dropping the heavy legal term into the room like an anvil. It is a severe federal offense. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. And you did not just commit mortgage fraud. You committed wire fraud when you transferred those funds across state lines to pay your ridiculous debts. You committed bank fraud by lying to a federally insured institution. You broke a half-dozen federal laws the second the ink dried on this contract. Beatrice was shaking violently, her hands gripping her hair. You cannot do this, Nia, she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. He is your brother. You cannot let them send him to prison. You have the money. You control the trust. Just pay the bank back, pay off the loan and make this go away. You have to save him. I turned my gaze to my mother, letting the absolute zero temperature of my eyes freeze the frantic pleas in her throat. "I do not have to do anything, Beatrice," I replied smoothly. "I am the trustee of the estate. My sole fiduciary duty is to protect the assets of the trust, and when someone attempts to place a fraudulent $5 million lien against properties belonging to my trust, I am legally obligated to act." I looked back at Jamal, ensuring he heard every single detail of his destruction. "Because I am the legal owner of those buildings, the bank is required to notify me when a title search is initiated for a lien," I explained, enjoying the look of absolute devastation washing over his features. "I received an automated alert from the county clerk's office yesterday morning. A commercial lender was attempting to verify the deeds on Auburn Avenue." Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head side to side in a pathetic rhythm of denial. "I did not just block the lien, Jamal," I said, my voice ringing with an undeniable victorious finality. "I pulled the security footage from the bank. I pulled the loan application. I pulled the fraudulent Houston will you used to secure the funds, and I sent every single piece of paper directly to the bank's internal fraud department." Desmond let out a sound that was half groan, half sob. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking, and then I continued, pausing for dramatic effect. "I sent a duplicate file to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words hit the room with the force of a physical explosion. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The reality of those 4 words completely shattered whatever fragile remnants of hope my family had been clinging to. They were no longer fighting over an inheritance. They were fighting for their freedom, and they had already lost. Jamal let out a loud, agonizing wail. He curled in on himself, pulling his knees up toward his chest, rocking back and forth in the heavy leather chair. He was a broken, ruined man, completely stripped of his arrogance, facing years behind federal bars. Suddenly, the sharp electronic marimba ringtone of a smartphone shattered the heavy silence. Everyone jumped. Tasha spun around, her eyes wide with terror, staring at her phone resting face down on the mahogany table. The screen was illuminated, vibrating violently against the wood. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the device, terrified of what news awaited her on the other end of the line. The phone stopped ringing. A second later, it started again. Then a barrage of rapid-fire text message notifications chimed in quick succession. Ping, 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 ping. "Answer it, Tasha," I commanded, my voice dripping with cold authority. "It is probably your investors. They tend to panic when federal agents start freezing bank accounts." Tasha snatched the phone off the table. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She swiped her thumb across the screen, her eyes scanning the notifications. As she read, her jaw dropped, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "They froze the accounts," Tasha whispered, her voice barely audible over Jamal's sobbing. "The bank froze the restaurant accounts. The contractors are threatening to sue. The network producers just texted. They are pulling the contract. They said they cannot ensure a reality show centered around a federal criminal investigation." She looked up, her heavily lashed eyes fixing on Jamal with a look of absolute burning hatred. "We have nothing!" Tasha screamed, her voice cracking, hurling the phone onto the desk. "We are entirely broke. You lied to me, Jamal. You said the money was secure. You said we were going to be rich. You signed a fraudulent loan, and now I am married to a felon. My career is dead. The restaurant is dead. I am going to lose everything because of you." Jamal did not answer. He just continued to rock back and forth, entirely consumed by the reality of his impending incarceration. Beatrice rushed to Jamal's side, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders, glaring at me with a look of absolute venomous maternal fury. "You are a monster, Nia," my mother spat, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "You planned this. You trapped your own brother. You destroyed this family." I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored skirt, towering over them, radiating absolute control. "I did not destroy this family." "Beatrice," I stated, my voice echoing through the quiet office with absolute terrifying clarity. "I simply stopped letting you destroy me. You built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, greed, and entitlement. I just opened the window and let the wind blow it down. I reached out and gathered my manila folders, slipping them neatly back into my briefcase. I snapped the brass clasps shut. "You are dismissed," I said, looking at the broken, weeping remnants of my family. "Attorney Sterling will handle the eviction notices for the penthouse and the Buckhead estate. I suggest you spend whatever cash you have left on a very good criminal defense attorney. You are going to need it." Tasha did not weep for her husband. The brief moment of shock that had paralyzed her completely evaporated, replaced instantly by a vicious, unadulterated rage. She looked at Jamal not with the compassion of a supportive spouse, but with the absolute revulsion of a predator that had just realized its meal was poisoned. The glamorous, wealthy lifestyle she had curated for her 500,000 followers was dead. Her restaurant was a crime scene. Her husband was a massive walking federal liability. "You stupid, incompetent fraud!" Tasha shrieked, her voice shattering the remaining silence in the room. Her heavy acrylic nails dug into the edge of Attorney Sterling's desk as she leaned over it, screaming directly into Jamal's face. "You promised me an empire. You told me you had this handled. You told me she was weak, and you were the smart one. You are nothing. You are a broke, pathetic loser who just dragged me into a federal bank fraud investigation." Jamal flinched, holding his hands up in a desperate, trembling gesture of surrender. "Tasha, baby, please," he begged, his voice a pathetic whine. "We can fix this. I will talk to the bank. I will tell them it was a misunderstanding. Do not leave me." "Fix it!" Tasha screamed. Her face flushed dark red with fury. "The FBI has the paperwork, Jamal. There is no fixing federal prison. I am not going down with you. I am not spending the best years of my life visiting you behind glass. We are done. I am done with you. I am done with this broke, toxic family." With a violent, jerky motion, Tasha grabbed her left hand. She yanked the massive, ostentatious diamond ring off her finger. The stone, purchased with money Jamal never actually had, caught the overhead light for a fraction of a second before she hurled it. The heavy platinum band slammed onto the mahogany table, skittering violently across the polished wood, and collided with the fraudulent quitclaim deed. Tasha snatched her smartphone, spun on her designer heels, and marched toward the heavy oak doors. She did not look back. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening final crack that seemed to physically rattle my brother's bones. Jamal let out a hollow, agonizing groan, burying his face in his hands as his entire world disintegrated into ash. With the sudden, violent departure of my sister-in-law, the illusion of Washington family superiority finally broke. The proud, untouchable facade that my parents had hidden behind for decades shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The reality of the FBI, the bank fraud, and the absolute loss of their wealth crashed over them like a tidal wave. Beatrice dropped her expensive handbag onto the floor. She stumbled forward, her knees giving out completely, and she practically collapsed against the edge of the conference table. Her perfectly styled hair was in ruins. Mascara ran down her cheeks in thick black rivers. The haughty, demanding matriarch vanished, replaced by a desperate, terrified woman begging for her life. "Nia, please," Beatrice wept, reaching her trembling hands out toward me, her voice breaking into loud, humiliating sobs. "Please, my baby, you cannot do this. You cannot let them take your brother away. He made a mistake. He was just confused. He did not understand the law. You are the trustee. You have the money. You control billions of dollars in that trust. Just write the check." My mother clasped her hands together in a posture of desperate prayer. "Pay the bank back, Nia," she pleaded, her tears falling freely onto Sterling's desk. "Pay off the $5 million. Make the fraud charges go away. You have the power to save him. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot let your own flesh and blood go to a federal cage. Please forgive us. Forgive him." Desmond pushed himself up from his chair. The booming, terrifying patriarch who had terrorized my childhood was entirely gone. His broad shoulders sagged under an invisible, crushing weight. He looked small, old, and utterly broken. He shuffled around the edge of the desk, his eyes wide and pleading. "Nia, listen to your mother." Desmond begged, his voice thick with tears he had not shed in decades. I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything I said. I was wrong. I was arrogant. I see that now. But you have to protect the Washington name. If Jamal goes to prison for bank fraud, our legacy is destroyed. We will be ruined in this city. You have the resources to quietly erase this entire mess. I am begging you, daughter to father. Save our name. I looked down at them. I looked at Beatrice weeping on her knees, and Desmond offering pathetic apologies to save his own social standing. I looked at Jamal, a sniveling, defeated criminal crying over a wife who had abandoned him at the first sign of poverty. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity. There was no lingering familial guilt. There was only the cold, sterile satisfaction of a surgical extraction successfully completed. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a smooth, deliberate motion. I reached down and began buttoning my tailored blazer, my movements precise, calm, and completely unbothered by the chaotic weeping filling the room. I adjusted my cuffs, ensuring my armor was perfectly in place. Then I looked down at the pathetic remnants of my bloodline. You wanted me to be the failure so badly. You failed to see the empire I was building right in front of you, I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, lethal register that instantly silenced their begging. You were so blinded by your greed and your arrogant assumptions that you walked blindly into a vault and locked the door behind yourselves. I picked up my briefcase, the leather handle cool and solid against my palm. You begged me to save the Washington family name. I continued, my gaze locking onto my father's terrified eyes. The Washington name was ruined the moment you prioritized your vanity over your own father's life. It was ruined the second you encouraged my brother to steal from a dying man. I am not saving your name, Desmond. I am burying it. I turned my attention to my mother, who was staring up at me with wide, horrified eyes, realizing that her tears held absolutely no currency here. Blood makes you related, I stated, delivering the final absolute truth with surgical precision. Loyalty makes you family. You have neither. I turned away from them and looked at Attorney Sterling. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded over the red-sealed binder, observing the execution with silent professional approval. Execute the eviction notices immediately. Attorney Sterling, I instructed, my voice crisp and authoritative. Contact the bank's fraud department and inform them that the trustee will fully cooperate with all federal investigations regarding Jamal Washington. Do not offer them a single cent of trust capital. Yes, Ms. Washington. Sterling replied, nodding his head in profound respect. It will be handled before the hour is up. I did not look back. I did not need to. I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the conference room. Behind me, Jamal let out a fresh, agonizing wail of despair. Beatrice screamed my name, her voice cracking with absolute panic as her reality shattered into dust. Desmond began shouting, begging, pleading for a mercy he had never once offered me. I pulled the heavy doors open and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the law firm. The heavy oak slammed shut behind me, instantly muffling their screams, reducing their chaotic ruin to a distant, irrelevant hum. I walked down the hallway, the rhythmic click of my heels echoing with absolute authority. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the steel doors slid shut, cutting off the last faint sounds of my family's destruction, I felt a massive, heavy weight permanently lift from my shoulders. The suffocating chains of obligation, the desperate need for validation, the lingering ghosts of childhood inadequacy. They were all gone, burned away in the fire they had started themselves. I walked out of the towering glass lobby of the law firm and stepped directly into the bright, warm Atlanta sun. The air felt incredibly fresh, clean, and vibrant. I reached into my purse, pulled out my designer sunglasses, and slipped them onto my face, shielding my eyes from the glare. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto the bustling city street, I did not feel any regret. I did not feel any sorrow. I drove away in absolute, undeniable peace, completely financially secure, and for the first time in my entire life, entirely free.